Section 1. The World of Spooner Street. What you think you know. There is something deeply comforting about the sound of that theme song. You know the one. The piano hits its first notes. The family settles into the couch, and before a single joke lands, you already feel at home. That is the strange magic of Family Guy, a show that has been running since 1999, that has been canceled and resurrected, that has made people furious and made people cry and made people pause their screens at 2 in the morning just to read a headline joke in the background. And yet most people who watch it, who have watched it for years or decades, still think they understand it completely. They think it is a comedy about a bumbling father in a Rhode Island town. They think it is a show about a baby who wants to kill his mother, and a dog who wants to write novels, and a teenager who gets bullied, and a son who eats too much, and a daughter who is ignored. They think the jokes are random, the cutaways are filler, and the world of Spooner Street is nothing more than a stage set for gags. Tonight, we are going to take all of that apart. Not in an aggressive way, not in a way that will leave you unsettled or anxious. The point of this video is to sit with you in the quiet hours wherever you are right now, in bed, on a couch, maybe somewhere far from home, and walk you through the hidden architecture of one of the most secretly complex animated shows ever made. We are going to talk about the theories that fans have been building and debating for 25 years. We are going to look at the Easter eggs hidden in plain sight, the ones so small and so deliberate that you have to wonder whether the animators were leaving messages just for the people paying close attention. So let us start at the beginning. Or rather, let us start with what you think the beginning is. Family Guy premiered on January 31st, 1999. It came right after the Super Bowl, Super Bowl 33 to be precise, which meant that roughly 22 million people watched the first episode, not because they sought it out, but because it was simply there when the game ended. 22 million people saw the Griffin family for the first time in that passive, half-awake state that happens after a major television event, and somehow a large portion of them came back. The show was created by Seth MacFarlane, who was 24 years old when it debuted. A fact that explains a great deal about the show's particular blend of irreverence and hidden sentimentality. Spooner Street itself is fictional, set in the fictional city of Quahog, Rhode Island. But the show is obsessive about real Rhode Island geography in ways that casual viewers never notice. The state is referenced so precisely and so frequently that fans who actually live in Rhode Island have spent years cataloging the accuracies and the deliberate inaccuracies. Quahog, for instance, sits roughly where the actual city of Cranston would be. The Drunken Clam, the bar where Peter and his friends spend most of their free time, is geographically positioned in ways that would place it near actual Rhode Island landmarks if you mapped it carefully enough. This level of specificity in a show that also features a giant chicken fighting a middle-aged man for 10 minutes straight is not an accident. It tells you something about the people who make this show, that they care about the bones of the world even when the flesh of it is completely absurd. Now let us talk about the Griffin house itself, because this is where many of the most enduring theories begin. The house at 31 Spooner Street is a colonial-style home in what appears to be a middle-class neighborhood. Peter works at a brewery. Lois gives piano lessons. By the logic of their world, they should not be able to afford this house. Fans have calculated the square footage, estimated the property taxes in Rhode Island, compared it to what a brewery worker and a part-time piano teacher would actually earn, and the numbers do not work. They have never worked. Some fans have dismissed this as the standard television fantasy of working-class families living in impossibly large homes, a tradition going back to the Flintstones and running through Married with Children and Roseanne and The Simpsons. But other fans have used this financial impossibility as the foundation of a much darker theory, one we will return to later tonight. The neighborhood around Spooner Street is populated by a small, recurring cast of characters who have their own impossible lives. Joe Swanson is a paraplegic police officer who somehow maintains the physique of a professional athlete. Quagmire is a man whose age is officially listed on his driver's license, but makes no biological sense whatsoever. Cleveland Brown ran a barbershop, despite apparently never actually cutting anyone's hair on screen. These are surface-level absurdities, the kind you absorb without thinking. but they accumulate. And when you start to look at all of them together, the neighborhood stops feeling like a place where the rules were bent for comedic convenience and starts feeling like a place where the rules were bent for a reason. There is an episode in the very early seasons where Peter discovers that the town of Quahog was originally founded by his own ancestor. This backstory gives Peter a strange kind of ownership over the world he inhabits. He did not arrive in Quahog, he is, in some ancestral sense, from it. His family is woven into the town's origin. This detail sits quietly in the mythology of the show and rarely gets referenced again. But it matters for one of the deeper theories we will explore tonight. The idea that Quahog is, in some sense, Peter's world. Not just the world he lives in, but a world that exists because of him, shaped around him, maintained by his perception. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. For now, let us just sit with the surface. Let us appreciate what the show presents before we start pulling it apart. The Griffin family, Peter, Lois, Chris, Meg, Stewie, and Brian, are, on the face of things, a family built on dysfunction held together by something real. Peter is loud, impulsive, and often genuinely cruel in ways the show acknowledges without fully condemning. Lois is the long-suffering wife who is also, when you pay attention, significantly more complicated than the archetype she appears to represent. Chris is the sweet, dim son who carries a surprising amount of emotional sensitivity in a show that often forgets to credit him for it. Meg is the punching bag, the target, the daughter the family treats with casual contempt. But we will spend a long time on Meg tonight because she is one of the most fascinating and misunderstood characters the show has ever produced. Stewie is the baby. Brian is the dog. And both of them exist in a register so far removed from the rest of the family that they sometimes feel like they belong to a different show entirely. A show that might be significantly more tragic than the one surrounding them. What makes Family Guy different from other animated comedies, what makes it worth spending 3 hours exploring, is the degree to which the show seems aware of its own contradictions. It makes jokes about its own cancellation. It breaks the fourth wall so often that the fourth wall has essentially ceased to exist. It introduces continuity and then abandons it. It kills characters and brings them back. It ages characters and then resets them. All of this could be laziness. All of it could be the natural entropy of a show that has run for over 20 seasons without a firm editorial hand. But there is another possibility. And this is the possibility that the best Family Guy theorists keep returning to. That the contradictions are not failures of continuity, but features of a deliberately unstable world. A world, in other words, that does not quite follow the rules of reality because it was never meant to. We will get into what that might mean in a great deal more depth as the night goes on. But I want you to hold on to that idea as you settle in. The idea that everything you have been watching might be operating on a different set of rules than you assumed. That the randomness is not random. That the gaps in logic are themselves a kind of logic. Before we move on, I want to ask you something. Drop a comment right now and tell me where in the world you are watching this from, and what time it is. It is one of my favorite things, knowing that somewhere, someone in a different country, a different time zone, a different season entirely is falling asleep to the same theories I'm going to walk through tonight. And if you have not subscribed yet, this is the moment to do it. We do these long-form deep dives regularly, and you do not want to miss the ones coming up. Just hit the button and let us keep going, because we are only just getting started. Section 2. The Purgatory Theory. Are the Griffins already dead? Let us begin this section with a question that sounds absurd when you say it out loud, but becomes harder and harder to dismiss the longer you sit with it. What if the Griffin family is dead? Not metaphorically dead. Not creatively dead. Not dead as in the show has run its course. Actually dead. As in, what if every episode of Family Guy takes place in some form of afterlife, and the world of Quahog is not a living, breathing American suburb, but a kind of purgatory or limbo state in which the Griffins are trapped, cycling through existence without the ability to age, change permanently, or escape? This theory has been circulating in fan communities since at least the mid-2000s, and it has proven remarkably durable. Not because it explains everything, but because it explains something so well that it is difficult to come up with a more satisfying alternative. Let us start with the evidence that most commonly gets cited. The first and most obvious piece is the show's complete refusal to allow time to pass in any meaningful way. Family Guy has been airing for over 25 years. The children have not grown up. Stewie is still a baby. Chris and Meg are still in the same grades they were in during the early seasons. Peter still works the same job, lives in the same house, weighs roughly the same amount. In the real world, a family that has existed for 25 years would be unrecognizable compared to who they were at the start. But in Quahog, the calendar seems to be broken. Seasons change, holidays happen, references to current events appear and then disappear, but the people remain fixed. Now you might say, this is just how animated sitcoms work. The Simpsons has the same problem. Futurama dealt with it by leaning into it deliberately. King of the Hill ran for 13 seasons and the kids barely aged. This is a genre convention, not a narrative signal. And that is a fair objection. Except that Family Guy does something the others do not quite do in the same way. It acknowledges the problem, repeatedly, directly, with a level of self-awareness that goes beyond a wink at the audience. Characters have noted their own failure to age. Episodes have directly confronted the question of why time does not seem to pass. The show has built entire storylines around the idea of time loops and alternative realities and simulated existences. For a show that just wanted to make jokes and not worry about continuity, Family Guy spends a suspicious amount of time thinking about the nature of time. The purgatory theory takes this observation and asks, what if the timelessness is the point? What if the Griffins are unable to age or change because they are not subject to the normal flow of time? Because they exist in a state where time, in the traditional sense, does not apply. Purgatory in the traditional theological sense is a place of waiting and purification. It is not heaven and not hell. It is a middle state, a transitional space. The soul exists there until it has resolved whatever it needs to resolve in order to move on. If you map this onto the Griffins, something interesting happens. Each member of the family seems to be trapped in a particular emotional or spiritual struggle that never quite resolves. Peter is trapped in a cycle of impulsive behavior, genuine remorse, and then the same impulsive behavior again. He hurts people, he apologizes, he does it again. He loves his family but demonstrates that love so inadequately and so inconsistently that the love itself is almost beside the point. His defining struggle in learning to be a better father and husband, learning to think before he acts, never actually gets resolved. Every episode resets him. If purgatory is a place where you work through your unresolved issues, Peter is a man with a very, very long sentence. Lois is trapped in the tension between who she was and who she became. She came from money, from a wealthy and somewhat corrupt family, and she chose a life with Peter that represented a kind of escape from that world. But the resentments, the suppressed desires, the moments when her refined upbringing crashes against her chaotic present, these never resolve either. She is endlessly cycling between contentment and frustration, between accepting her life and feeling obscurely cheated by it. Chris struggles with self-worth and identity in ways that the show rarely explores with any depth, but that are consistently present in the background. He is overlooked by everyone, including the show itself, and his quiet, gentle nature makes him perhaps the most purely sympathetic character in the entire cast, which also makes him the one who seems most clearly to be waiting for something he cannot name. Meg's situation is the most obviously purgatorial of all. She exists in a state of perpetual social humiliation, perpetual rejection, perpetual longing for acceptance that never arrives. The show treats her suffering as a running joke for most of its run, but the sheer relentlessness of her misery, the way it never improves, never gives way to anything better, never allows her a lasting victory, has the quality of a specific kind of punishment. She is Sisyphus in a Quahog High Letterman jacket. Stewie's genius is his curse. He is the most intellectually capable being in his world, perhaps in any world, and he is trapped in the body of an infant. He cannot be taken seriously. He cannot act on his ambitions without being foiled by his own physicality. He builds time machines and laser guns and elaborate schemes, and none of it amounts to anything lasting. He is stuck. Eternally, cyclically stuck. And Brian drinks. Brian writes novels that never get published. Brian falls in love with women who do not love him back. Brian philosophizes about the nature of existence in a way that suggests he is deeply, fundamentally dissatisfied with it. He died once fully and completely in a season 12 episode where he was struck by a car, and the emotional weight of that episode was enormous. It felt different from the show's typical treatment of death. It felt final, and then he came back, 2 episodes later, via Stewie's time machine, and the finality was erased. But here's what the purgatory theorists note about Brian's death and resurrection. It never fully reset. Brian came back, yes, but the episode following his return carried a strange emotional residue. Characters who had grieved him genuinely, including Quagmire, did not fully return to normal. Something had shifted, even if the show did not want to fully acknowledge what. As if the death had been real and the return was the anomaly. There is another dimension to the purgatory theory that gets less attention but is worth sitting with. In many religious and philosophical traditions, purgatory or its equivalent is not experienced by the souls within it as a place of punishment. The souls within it may not even be fully aware that they are there. They continue living in the way they lived before, repeating the same patterns, unable to progress, without necessarily understanding why they cannot progress. The world around them continues to seem normal. Only an outside observer can see the stasis. If this is true of the Griffins, then the comedy of the show takes on an entirely different texture. The cutaway gags, the random tangents, the jokes that seem to have no narrative purpose. These could be the mental detritus of souls who have been in limbo long enough that their thoughts have become untethered from any forward momentum. When Peter has a flashback that has nothing to do with the plot. When a cutaway takes you somewhere completely unrelated for 30 seconds and then snaps back, you are witnessing the cognitive drift of someone who has been cycling in the same existence for so long that their mind no longer distinguishes between what is happening and what is simply remembered or imagined. That is a striking idea, and the more you watch the show through that lens, the stranger and more coherent the randomness becomes. There is one more piece of this theory that deserves attention, and it involves the town of Quahog itself. Quahog is, in many ways, an impossible place. Not impossible in terms of geography. We already talked about how precisely it maps onto real Rhode Island, but impossible in terms of the events that happen there. Quahog has been destroyed and rebuilt multiple times. It has been invaded by aliens, occupied by foreign governments, subjected to biblical plagues, visited by celebrities who interact with the locals as though this is normal, afflicted by epidemics and natural disasters and events of global historical significance that somehow leave no lasting trace. The town resets. Every catastrophe is absorbed and forgotten. Every earthquake gets rebuilt. Every invasion ends and life returns to exactly what it was. This is not how places work. Places change. Places carry their history. A town that gets destroyed and rebuilt does not look the same as it did before. It looks like a town that was destroyed and rebuilt. But Quahog always looks exactly the same. The drunken clam is always there. The Griffin house is always there. The neighborhood is always intact. Unless, of course, the town is not a real place at all. Unless it is an environment designed to contain certain souls. An environment that resets because it needs to reset in order to maintain the conditions of the containment. This is where the purgatory theory gets genuinely unsettling if you let it, because it suggests that everything the Griffins have experienced, the adventures, the disasters, the moments of genuine connection and genuine loss, none of it has left a permanent mark. They keep having experiences that should change them fundamentally, and they keep returning to baseline. The only explanation for that, outside of authorial laziness or genre convention, is that something beyond their control is keeping them in place. Something is not finished with them yet. We are going to hold that thought and carry it through the rest of tonight, because the purgatory theory connects to almost every other major theory we will discuss, and some of them are going to take it in directions that are even stranger than this. Section 3. Stewie Griffin. The evil genius the world never fully understood. If you were going to write a character designed to make audiences deeply uncertain about how they are supposed to feel, you could not do much better than Stewie Griffin. He is, on the surface, a joke. A baby with a British accent who talks about world domination and builds elaborate weapons in his bedroom. The gag is the contrast. The smallest, most helpless-seeming person in the room also being the most dangerous and the most intelligent. It is a classic comedic inversion, and it works reliably well. You can watch any Stewie scene without context and get the joke immediately. But Stewie Griffin is not a joke. Or rather, he is a joke that has been running long enough and been developed with enough consistency and internal logic that he has become something much more than whatever he started as. He is one of the most psychologically complex characters in the history of American animated television, and the theories that surround him are some of the richest and most debated in the entire Family Guy fan community. Let us start with the most fundamental question. Why does Stewie want to kill Lois? In the early seasons, this was framed as a simple comedic premise. Baby hates Mother. Baby plots elaborate murders. Mother remains oblivious. The disconnect between Stewie's intelligence and the world's failure to notice it was the engine of the joke. But as the seasons went on and the show developed Stewie further, a more complicated picture emerged. The hatred toward Lois became less absolute, more ambivalent. Episodes explored the degree to which Stewie actually loves his mother and is terrified of that love. The murderous impulse began to look less like genuine malice and more like a defense mechanism, a way of controlling his own emotional vulnerability by externalizing it as aggression. One of the most discussed episodes in this context is a two-part story arc called Stewie Kills Lois and Lois Kills Stewie, which aired in the 6th season. In it, Stewie finally, actually on screen, with apparent permanence, kills Lois. She is shot. She goes overboard a cruise ship. She is presumed dead. And then, a year later in the story, she comes back, and the two of them have a final confrontation where Lois shoots Stewie in retaliation, and he dies. It is shocking. It plays the premise completely straight. And then, at the very end, it is revealed that the entire two-part arc was a simulation. Stewie had run the scenario through a computer program to see how it would play out, and none of it was real. The reaction in the fan community to this reveal was mixed, to put it mildly. Some fans felt it was a clever meta move, the show acknowledging that it can never actually resolve the Stewie kills Lois storyline without destroying itself. Others felt it was a cheat, a way of having the dramatic stakes without committing to them. But the theorists found something else in it entirely. The fact that Stewie ran the simulation at all. He ran it. He sat down and programmed a detailed, realistic scenario in which he killed his mother, watched the full consequences play out, saw what happened to his family and his world when she was gone, and then decided not to do it. The simulation was not a fantasy, it was a test run, and he observed the results of the test run and chose not to proceed. What does that tell you about Stewie? It tells you that on some level he does not want to kill Lois, that he is intelligent enough to know he does not want to, and that the homicidal posturing is covering something else entirely. The theory that has gained the most traction is that Stewie's aggression toward Lois is really a displaced expression of his desperate need for her attention and approval. He is a neglected child, not in any dramatic, abusive sense, but in the ordinary suburban sense of a mother who has too much going on to give her youngest the specific, focused attention he craves. His intelligence makes the neglect more painful because he understands it more clearly than most infants could. And his response to that pain is to invert it, to turn the longing for closeness into a declared desire for destruction. This is, in psychological terms, a recognizable pattern. When someone feels they cannot have what they want, they sometimes redirect that wanting into its opposite. Stewie cannot be the kind of son who receives the love and validation he craves, so he performs the role of the villain who has transcended the need for any of it. But the performance keeps slipping. In episodes where Lois gives him genuine, undivided attention, his hostility evaporates almost instantly. He becomes warm. He becomes vulnerable. He becomes, in those moments, exactly the child he refuses to be the rest of the time. Now let us talk about Stewie's sexuality, because this is one of the most discussed aspects of the character and one of the most genuinely complicated questions the show has raised. For most of the show's early run, Stewie's sexuality was played as ambiguous comedy. He would make remarks that suggested attraction to other males, then the show would walk it back or play it as a joke. Seth MacFarlane, in an interview that has been widely discussed, said that he considers Stewie to be ultimately gay, or at least a very unhappy, repressed heterosexual. This is an extraordinary thing for a creator to say about a character. That the character's own sexuality is something the character has not fully worked out, and that the ambiguity itself is part of who the character is. The repression reading is particularly interesting. If Stewie is repressing something, whether it is his sexuality or something more fundamental about his identity, then the hostility, the megalomania, the obsessive need to control and dominate his environment all take on an additional layer of meaning. The control is compensation. The domination is a substitute for a vulnerability he cannot bring himself to express. The elaborate schemes and the weapon building and the time travel are, in this reading, the activities of someone who has decided that the world is safer when it is being conquered than when it is simply being inhabited with openness. The time machine deserves its own discussion because it is one of the most theoretically significant elements in the entire show. Stewie builds a time machine in the first season. He builds it as a baby, and over the course of the show, he uses it repeatedly. To go back and fix mistakes, to go forward and observe consequences, to visit alternative timelines and parallel versions of his world. The time machine does not just make Stewie a funny anomaly. It makes him potentially the most important character in the entire cosmology of the show. Because if Stewie can travel through time, then the timeline of Family Guy is not fixed. Events can be changed. Deaths can be reversed. The past and the future are both malleable. This has enormous implications for the purgatory theory we discussed earlier. If the Griffins are in some form of limbo, and if Stewie has a time machine, then there are two possibilities. Either the time machine does not work as it appears to, perhaps it operates within the confines of the purgatory, and the changes it makes are also confined to that space. Or Stewie is uniquely able to move through the time stream in ways that the other souls in the limbo cannot. He is the variable. He is the anomaly in the system. There is a theory built around this idea that is sometimes called the Stewie Prime theory. It suggests that across the many time loops and alternative timelines that Stewie has created through his use of the time machine, there is a version of Stewie, a Stewie Prime, who has been through so many iterations of the timeline that he has accumulated memories and awareness that the other characters do not possess. The Stewie we see in any given episode is not a fixed character, but a composite, built from the residue of hundreds of timelines, each one having shaped him in some small way that he cannot quite articulate. This would explain something that fans have long noted about Stewie's character arc. The way he shifts, sometimes within a single season, between the genuinely threatening, world domination-oriented version of himself and the more emotionally vulnerable, domestically focused version. He is not inconsistently written. He is a character who has literally been through different versions of himself, and the different versions keep bleeding through. The most emotionally resonant version of Stewie Griffin, the one that appears in the episodes that fans consistently rank as the show's best, is the one who is not plotting anything. The episodes where Stewie and Brian interact as genuine companions, talking about their lives and their fears and their deepest uncertainties. The road trip episodes. The episodes where Stewie is briefly transported to a future version of his life and finds it lacking in ways he cannot quite articulate. These are the episodes where the baby genius disappears and what remains is something that feels startlingly real. A person who is brilliant but lost, capable of almost anything but uncertain about what any of it means. There is an episode that a lot of fans return to when they want to argue that Family Guy is a better show than its reputation allows, where Stewie runs away and ends up living with a family that actually pays attention to him. The episode explores in a surprisingly gentle way what Stewie might be like if he received the emotional environment he has always needed. And the answer the episode gives is both heartwarming and heartbreaking. He would be a different person. He would be happier, simpler, less driven by compensatory rage. He would be, in the most surprising sense, ordinary. And then he goes back to Spooner Street, because ordinary is not an option for Stewie Griffin. Maybe because it never has been. Maybe because in the world he inhabits, the impossible, timeless, cycling world of Quahog, nobody ever gets to be ordinary for long. Section 4. Brian Griffin's Hidden Depths and the Death That Shook Everything. There is a strange phenomenon that happens when you have watched a show long enough. The characters stop being characters in the way they were at the beginning. They become presences, familiar, expected, woven into the texture of your relationship with the show itself. And when one of those presences is suddenly, unexpectedly removed, the grief that follows is disproportionate to what you might logically expect to feel about a fictional dog. Brian Griffin died on November 24, 2013. He was struck by a car in the episode titled Life of Brian. Not the Monty Python film, though the title choice feels deliberate in retrospect. And he died on screen in a way that the show had never quite handled a death before. Stewie was unable to save him. The time machine had been destroyed earlier in the episode, and there was no mechanism available for reversal. Brian died, and the Griffin family grieved him. And 2 episodes later, Stewie found a way to go back in time and save him, and Brian came back. The internet's response to Brian's death is worth examining on its own terms because it tells you something about what Brian means to the people who watch this show. The outcry was enormous, immediate, and emotionally raw in a way that surprised even longtime fans of the series. Petitions were circulated. There were think pieces. Seth MacFarlane acknowledged the response and later admitted, in various interviews, that the death was always intended to be temporary. That Stewie would find a way to bring Brian back, and the whole arc would resolve within a month of broadcast time. Some fans felt manipulated by this. They felt that the show had used Brian's death as an emotional device without earning the permanence that would have made it meaningful. Others argued that even a temporary death served a purpose, that it clarified for anyone who had not been paying attention exactly how central Brian is to the emotional life of the show. Without Brian, Family Guy becomes something recognizably different, less reflective, less sad, in the specific way that Brian's presence makes the show sad, less aware of itself, because that is Brian's function beneath all the wine jokes and the unpublished novels and the liberal politics. Brian is the show's conscience. He is the character who most often steps back and notices the strange, melancholy texture of the world he inhabits. He is the one who asks the questions that none of the other characters think to ask, who pushes back against the comfortable absurdity of Quahog with something that looks uncomfortably like insight. Let us talk about who Brian Griffin actually is beyond the surface presentation. He is a dog who lives with a human family and is treated most of the time as a combination of family member, roommate, and pet. The ontological status of Brian's personhood is never quite resolved. He can talk, drive a car, write novels, date women, order martinis, engage in sophisticated intellectual discourse. But he also sleeps in a dog bed sometimes, chases cars, and is legally Peter's property in any technical sense. This contradiction is played for comedy, but it is also, when you sit with it, genuinely troubling. Brian exists in a kind of permanent, in-between state. He is too human for the world to treat him as simply an animal, and too animal for the world to fully grant him the dignity it gives to humans. The fan theory that has emerged from this contradiction is one of the most quietly devastating ideas in all of Family Guy discourse. It suggests that Brian's alcoholism, his failed relationships, his string of half-finished creative projects, his chronic dissatisfaction with his own life, these are not character flaws in the traditional sense. They are the symptoms of someone who has spent his entire existence being unable to fully belong anywhere. He cannot be a dog. He has too much consciousness, too much awareness of himself and the world. He knows what he is missing, what he cannot access, what the humans around him have that he will never have. But he cannot fully be a person either. He is always, in some fundamental way, outside the circle. He dates humans and the relationships fail, not only because of his own personality flaws, which are real and significant, But because the asymmetry of his situation is simply too great to overcome, he can love a woman, but she will age. She will move through phases of her life. She will have children with someone human. And Brian will remain in his particular stasis, neither fully aging into a human lifespan, nor living the shorter, simpler life a dog might live. There is an episode where Brian discovers that he has a son, a human-presenting son named Dylan, from a relationship in Brian's past. The episode handles this with more emotional nuance than you might expect from a show that had, around the same time, a running gag about a chicken fight. Brian's response to fatherhood, his desire to be present and meaningful to his son in a way that his own absent parents never were for him, is played straight. And the sadness underneath it, the sense that even the possibility of genuine familial connection, is something Brian is always slightly failing to achieve, is unmistakable. The unpublished novel is perhaps the most enduring emblem of Brian's condition. He has been writing a novel for essentially the entire run of the show. He talks about it regularly. He drinks while thinking about it. He occasionally produces a draft that he is proud of, which then gets either rejected or mocked or both. The novel is never finished. It is never published. It hovers at the edge of completion permanently. Always almost there, always not quite. The theories about what the novel might represent vary. Some fans think it is simply a joke about pretentious, aspiring writers, a type that is ripe for satire and that Brian embodies perfectly. Others think it represents something more specific, Brian's inability to fully process his own experience into meaning. He has had more experiences than most beings in Quahog. He has time traveled, he has been to space in certain continuities, he has had relationships and friendships of genuine depth and complexity. But he cannot synthesize it. He cannot turn it into the kind of narrative that would make sense of his life. The novel keeps remaining unfinished because Brian does not yet understand his own story well enough to write it. This is the saddest version of the Brian theory, and it is the one that feels most true when you watch the show with it in mind. He is a writer who cannot write the thing he most needs to write. He is an intellectual who cannot reach the insight that would make his intelligence useful to him. He is a lover who cannot sustain the connections he wants to sustain. He is a father who keeps being absent, then present, then absent again. And he is a dog. In a world that mostly treats that fact as incidental, it is never truly incidental. It is the fact that shapes everything else. The relationship between Brian and Stewie is the emotional core of the show, not the Peter-Lois relationship, which is the ostensible center. The Brian-Stewie dynamic is where the show's deepest emotional intelligence lives. They are improbable companions. A talking dog struggling to find meaning in his half-person existence, and a super-intelligent infant struggling to manage the gap between his inner world and his outer circumstances. They should have nothing in common. And yet the episodes that put them together consistently produce the show's most resonant moments. The theory that best accounts for this dynamic is one that sees Brian and Stewie as mirrors of each other. Stewie has too much ability and not enough freedom. He is capable of reshaping reality, but physically constrained from exercising that capability in any sustained way. Brian has too much awareness and not enough ability. He sees the world more clearly than most of the people around him, but lacks the tools to change what he sees. Together, they compensate for each other's limitations. Stewie provides the energy and imagination and capacity for action. Brian provides the emotional grounding, the sense of consequence, the quiet awareness that the things they do together matter. This is why Brian's death hit so hard, even for people who knew it was likely to be temporary. It was not just the loss of a character they liked. It was the disruption of the one relationship in the show that made the deepest kind of sense. The relationship between the two characters who both know, on some level, that their world is stranger and sadder than it appears, and who have decided to face that strangeness together. When Brian came back, the show did not spend much time processing what his death had meant. The timeline was restored, and the story moved on. But something had been established that could not be unestablished. That Brian's presence in the world of Quahog is not guaranteed. That even the most constant-seeming things in that world can be taken away. that the stability of Spooner Street is at some level provisional. That is a thought worth carrying as we continue tonight. Section 5. The Meg Griffin Truth. Real father, hidden identity, and the weight she carries. Here is something worth sitting with for a moment before we say anything else about Meg Griffin. She is the most realistically written character in Family Guy, and this is the reason she is treated the worst. Everyone else in the show operates at a kind of heightened level. Peter's stupidity is cartoonish. Lois's patience is operatic. Stewie's intelligence is superhuman. Brian's self-awareness is literary in its precision. Even Chris, the most grounded of the Griffin children, has a kind of gentle strangeness about him, a quality of mild, endearing unreality. But Meg is ordinary. Meg is a teenager who wants to be liked, who wants to belong, who has a crush on boys who do not notice her, who tries to join social groups that reject her, who has a family that treats her dismissively. Her suffering is proportional. Her emotions are recognizable. Her responses to the world are the responses of an actual person, not an animated archetype. And the show, in some sense, punishes her for this. The running gag of Meg's mistreatment is one of the most discussed and debated elements of Family Guy. Critics have called it lazy, cruel, cheap. The show's worst habit, a reliance on punching down at a character too pathetic to fight back. Defenders have argued that it is more sophisticated than it looks, that the very obviousness of the joke is part of the joke, a meta-commentary on the way society treats ordinary, unremarkable young women. Both readings contain truth, and neither one is the whole story. The whole story involves Meg's parentage. This is a fact revealed in the second season in an episode called Screwed the Pooch, and it is one of those pieces of information that the show introduces and then leaves to sit in the background, available to anyone paying attention but never foregrounded in any significant way. The revelation is this: Peter Griffin is not Meg's biological father. Meg's biological father is a man named Stan Thompson. He appears briefly and does not make a strong impression. He is a young man who had a relationship with Lois before she and Peter married, and Meg was the result. Peter, who married Lois while she was pregnant, adopted Meg and raised her as his own. He is, in every functional sense, her father. But he is not her father in the biological sense that makes Peter's consistent dismissal of Meg. The way he treats her as an afterthought, as a burden, as the family member least worthy of his attention and affection. Take on a more complex and troubling dimension. The most commonly discussed fan theory about Meg's parentage asks a simple question: does Peter know? Not in any conscious, articulated way, but on some deeper, submerged level. Does Peter sense, without being able to name it, that Meg is not his in the way that Chris is his, or Stewie is his? And does that unarticulated sensing, rather than anything specific about Meg herself, drive his inexplicable cruelty toward her? This theory is uncomfortable to sit with because it reframes Peter's behavior in a way that makes it more comprehensible but not more forgivable. It is one thing to dismiss Peter's cruelty as the random output of a character who is written as thoughtless and impulsive. It is another to locate that cruelty in a specific, if subconscious, awareness. To suggest that Meg is the target of Peter's displaced feelings about his own situation, about the choices Lois made before him, about the family he thought he was getting versus the family he actually has. There is also a more sympathetic reading of Meg's position that comes from the theory community, and this one argues that Meg's suffering is not merely the result of her family's cruelty, but is, in some sense, chosen. Not consciously, not deliberately, but as the load-bearing pillar of the family structure. There is a remarkable episode in Season 8 called Meg and Quagmire. Actually, the episode is called Quagmire's Baby, and the Meg-centric episode I'm thinking of is a different one. Let me be precise here. The episode in question is one where Meg finally, in a moment of rare directness, tells her family exactly what their treatment of her has cost her. And she ends the conversation not with triumph, but with resignation. She tells them that she has made peace with being the family's outlet for dysfunction, because the alternative, allowing the dysfunction to distribute itself more evenly, would destroy them. She is, in this reading, sacrificing herself. She absorbs the family's collective misery so that the rest of them do not have to. She is the scapegoat in the original, almost ritualistic sense of the word, the one on whom the community's darkness is loaded and then symbolically expelled. Without Meg in this role, the Griffins would have to confront what they actually are, and they are not ready for that. This reading of Meg is also supported by something that the show does rarely but consistently enough to be meaningful. It gives her moments of genuine competence, genuine connection, genuine joy, and then takes them away. Meg is shown to be a capable musician in several episodes. She has demonstrated intelligence and creativity in contexts where those traits are valued. She has had friendships and romantic connections that seem promising, and each time the show finds a way to remove or undercut the positive development and return her to her default state of marginalization. If you read this through the purgatory theory we discussed earlier, Meg's endless loop of almost success, followed by return to the baseline, looks very much like the specific torture of a soul that keeps approaching resolution and keeps being pulled back. She gets close to something better, and then Quahog resets. There is also a genetic dimension to the Meg theories that fans with a biological interest have developed with surprising rigor. The theory runs as follows. If Meg is the biological daughter of Stan Thompson and Lois Pewterschmidt, Lois being the daughter of a family with substantial genetic advantages in terms of conventional attractiveness and social aptitude, then Meg should, genetically speaking, be significantly more conventionally attractive and socially functional than she is presented as being in the show. The Pewterschmidt genes are strong. Lois's brother Patrick Pewterschmidt is physically imposing. Lois herself is drawn as conventionally attractive by the show's visual standards. Meg's appearance in the show, the hat, the glasses, the presentation that the show consistently uses as shorthand for social unattractiveness, is therefore, according to this theory, not a genetic outcome, but a choice. Meg dresses and presents herself in a way that communicates her social status before anyone else has the chance to assign it. She has preemptively accepted the role she has been given and costumed herself accordingly. Take away the costume. The episodes where Meg is shown without her trademark hat, or in context outside the high school social hierarchy, and what remains is a person who could, if the circumstances of her life were different, move through the world very differently. There is an episode that confirms this theory in ways that feel almost too obvious. A storyline in which Meg briefly becomes popular, where she is given access to social currency by some external mechanism, and where the show demonstrates clearly that Meg's unattractiveness is entirely contextual and social rather than intrinsic. When the circumstances change, so does Meg's place in them. When the circumstances revert, Meg reverts. This is one of the things that makes Meg Griffin, beneath all the jokes at her expense, one of the most quietly radical characters in the show. She demonstrates repeatedly and clearly that the social hierarchies her world is built on are entirely constructed, that popularity and attractiveness and belonging are performances that people practice, not qualities people possess. She demonstrates this not by succeeding at the performance, but by being its most visible casualty. And in being its casualty, she exposes it. The show rarely acknowledges this explicitly. It would rather make another "nobody loves Meg" joke than sit with the genuinely subversive implications of her character. But the implications are there for anyone willing to look. Before we move on, it is worth noting one more Meg theory that has gained traction in recent years. The suggestion that Meg is the only character in the show who is genuinely self-aware. The other characters are trapped in their patterns without being able to see the patterns. Stewie comes closest to true self-awareness, but his awareness is weaponized into megalomania. Brian can see the world clearly, but not himself. Peter and Lois cycle through the same conflicts without ever stepping back far enough to see the cycle. Meg in this reading knows exactly what is happening to her. She has always known. Her apparent passivity is not submission. It is the rational response of someone who has assessed the situation with clear eyes and concluded that the cost of fighting it exceeds what fighting it would produce. She is, in this reading, the most strategic player in the Griffin family, and her strategy is survival. Section 6. Quagmire's Impossible Age and the Incubus Theory. Glenn Quagmire is, on the surface, one of the simpler characters in the Family Guy cast. He is the joke neighbor, the sex-obsessed Lothario whose catchphrase and lifestyle are both built on the same comedic foundation. Giggity. The audience knows what Quagmire is before he opens his mouth in any given episode. He exists to embody a specific kind of social pathology in comedic form, and for many viewers, he never gets more complicated than that. But Quagmire is hiding something. And when you start looking at the evidence, what he is hiding is one of the most genuinely bizarre and unexplained mysteries in the entire mythology of Family Guy. The clue is on his driver's license. In an episode from around the 9th season, a camera lingers on Quagmire's driver's license long enough for attentive viewers to make out his date of birth. April 4th, 1948. At the time the episode aired, this would make Quagmire approximately 61 years old. 61. A man who is repeatedly presented as physically vital, energetic, apparently in the prime of his physical life, and who is apparently more than 60 years old. The show acknowledges this directly in a moment that might be the most casually absurd piece of exposition in the entire series. When characters confront Quagmire about his impossible youthfulness, his explanation is carrots. He eats a lot of carrots. This is clearly not intended as a serious answer. It is the show's way of saying, we know this does not make sense. We are not going to explain it. Move on. But the fan community did not move on, because fan communities never move on when there is a mystery available, and this one is genuinely strange. A man born in 1948 who looks 40. A man with a history, implied and occasionally explicit, that goes back decades further than his apparent age would allow. A man who seems to have had adventures and relationships and careers that span an impossible amount of time. The Quagmire age mystery has generated several competing theories, and the most popular one, the one that has persisted and grown the most elaborate over the years, is the incubus theory. An incubus in folklore and demonology is a supernatural entity that takes the form of an attractive man and seduces women, typically in their sleep. The incubus tradition appears in European folklore dating back to the medieval period, and likely earlier, with variations appearing across many different cultural traditions. The defining features of the incubus are supernatural attractiveness, an obsessive focus on sexual activity with a rotating cast of partners, and a lifespan far exceeding that of a normal human. The mapping onto Quagmire is, at minimum, evocative. Consider the evidence in its totality. Quagmire does not age at a normal rate. We have established this. He has an apparently insatiable appetite for sexual activity with a vast and varied range of partners. Also established. His attractiveness to women appears to be somewhat supernatural in its consistency. He is rarely shown to be rejected by women he actively pursues, in a way that goes beyond what his physical appearance alone would plausibly account for. He has a background in the Navy that he references occasionally, but never discusses in complete detail, suggesting a history that goes back further and runs deeper than the show is willing to explicitly depict. There is also the matter of Quagmire's family, which becomes relevant here. His father is revealed in a remarkable episode from Season 9 to be a transgender woman named Ida Davis, born Dan Quagmire, now living as Ida. This episode is famous for many reasons, primarily because it contains the most extreme exchange between Brian and Quagmire in the show's history, and because it handles a genuinely complex subject with a tonal unevenness that is either brave or clumsy, depending on how you read it. But for the purposes of the incubus theory, what matters is this. Quagmire's family history is unusual. His background is complicated. His origins are not what they appear to be on the surface, and the show has repeatedly indicated that there are things about Quagmire's past that the audience has not been told. The incubus theory suggests that Quagmire's behavior, the compulsive pursuit of sexual encounters, the apparent invulnerability to the social and personal consequences that most people would accumulate after decades of the lifestyle he leads, is explained not by his being a particularly effective human Lothario, but by his being something other than human altogether. a supernatural entity inhabiting a human form and performing a human life, while the fundamental nature of what he is remains hidden beneath the surface. This would explain the age. It would explain the vitality. It would explain the peculiar quality of his relationships with the other characters on Spooner Street. The way Quagmire is both central to the social world of the neighborhood and somehow also slightly outside it, slightly apart from it in a way that is hard to put into words. It would also explain the Quagmire-Brian feud, which is one of the show's most consistently entertaining dynamics and one of its most theoretically interesting. Glenn Quagmire hates Brian Griffin, specifically, personally, viscerally. His articulation of that hatred in the episode Jerome is the New Black is one of the most discussed monologues in Family Guy history. A long, detailed, specific accounting of exactly why Quagmire finds Brian insufferable. It is played for comedy, but it is also played for truth. The criticisms Quagmire makes of Brian in that monologue are largely accurate. Brian is pretentious. He uses his apparent intellectualism as a social tool. He is a worse person, in many ways, than his self-image allows him to acknowledge. The question the theorists ask is, why does Quagmire care so much? Brian is unpleasant in ways that lots of people around Quagmire are also unpleasant, but none of them generate this intensity of feeling. The hatred seems disproportionate. It seems personal in a way that goes beyond the rationalized explanations Quagmire provides. The incubus theory offers one answer, that Quagmire and Brian, being both somewhat supernatural in their situation, one a dog who lives as a person, one potentially a supernatural entity living as a human, recognize something in each other that the human characters around them do not. They see through each other's performances in a way that ordinary people cannot. And what Quagmire sees in Brian and hates is possibly what Quagmire most fears about himself. The inability to be fully honest about what one actually is. Brian's entire emotional life is shaped by the impossibility of belonging to the world he inhabits. He is a dog performing personhood and failing at both simultaneously. If Quagmire is an incubus performing humanity, then Brian's visible, unavoidable inauthenticity is a mirror that Quagmire does not want to look into. There is a less supernatural version of the Quagmire age theory that is worth mentioning for fairness. The idea that Quagmire simply lied on his driver's license, or that the driver's license is a continuity error, or that the show was making a one-time joke that got overinterpreted. These explanations are plausible. They are also much less interesting. And given the degree to which Family Guy has demonstrated over many seasons that it plants deliberate clues for attentive viewers to find, the less interesting explanation feels like the one that does not credit the show's writers with the intelligence they have, on multiple occasions, demonstrated they possess. There is also a further theory built around Quagmire that moves in a more melancholy direction, and it is one that has been discussed more quietly than the incubus theory, but has, I think, a great deal of genuine emotional resonance. The theory is simply this: Quagmire is deeply, chronically unhappy. The surface behavior, the giggity, the endless sexual pursuit, the cheerful exterior, is coping. It is the same kind of compensatory performance that we identified in Stewie's megalomania and Brian's alcoholism. Quagmire fills his life with encounters because encounters are temporary, and temporary things cannot disappoint you in the way that permanent things can. He has never had a relationship that worked. He has loved women and lost them. His father, now Ida, represents a complex web of feelings about identity and family that the show approaches awkwardly but genuinely. Quagmire's heart, beneath everything, is available in a way that his lifestyle seems designed to prevent anyone from noticing. There are moments, not brief, easily missed, where this breaks through. Quagmire sitting alone after a conquest has left. Quagmire expressing a wistful desire for something more real, and then immediately suppressing it with a joke. Quagmire reacting to Brian's death with grief that surprised many fans, given the antipathy between the two characters. But that made complete sense if you understood that Quagmire's hatred of Brian was itself a form of emotional investment. You do not feel that strongly about something or someone. that you genuinely do not care about. Whatever Quagmire is, human, supernatural, eternal, or something else entirely, he is one of the show's most unexplored reserves of genuine feeling. Somewhere beneath the impossible age and the impossible energy is someone who has been carrying something for a very long time, and who has developed very effective ways of making sure nobody sees it. Section 7. The Frozen Clock. Why Nobody Ages in Spooner Street. We touched on the timelessness of Quahog in our discussion of the purgatory theory, but the question of why nobody ages in Spooner Street is broad enough and strange enough to deserve its own careful examination. Because the aging issue, or rather the absolute consistent absence of aging, is one of the most distinctive and, if you think about it for long enough, one of the most philosophically disorienting aspects of the show. Let us get precise about what we mean. Family Guy has been airing since 1999. As of the most recent seasons, the show has referenced events from 2023, 2024, and beyond. Characters make contemporary cultural references. The world of Quahog includes smartphones, social media, streaming services, current political figures. The show is clearly aware that time is passing in the real world, and it incorporates that awareness regularly. And yet, nobody ages. Meg is still 16 or 17. Chris is still the age he was in Season 1. Stewie has been 1 year old for the entire run of the show. Peter and Lois look the same as they did in 1999. Their neighbors look the same. The town infrastructure looks the same. Babies born in early seasons remain babies indefinitely or simply stop appearing rather than growing up. The show is not unique in this. We already mentioned The Simpsons, and the list of animated series that practice what fans sometimes call floating timeline or perpetual present storytelling is long. But Family Guy is distinct from most of these shows in one crucial way. It has a mythology, it has a cosmology, it has time travel, parallel universes, and a character whose explicit superpower is the ability to manipulate temporal reality. In a show with a time machine in the basement, the failure of anyone to age becomes a plot point rather than a genre convention. The theories around the frozen clock fall broadly into 3 categories, and each one illuminates a different aspect of the show's hidden architecture. The first category is what we might call the solipsism theory. This is closely related to the Peter delusion theory we will explore later in the evening, but it has a distinct angle here. The solipsism theory suggests that the time loop of Quahog is maintained by the consciousness of a single observer, that the world of the show is a mental construct, and like all mental constructs, it does not follow the laws of physical reality unless the mind that produces it chooses to acknowledge those laws. Minds do not age by default. Time in a dream does not pass unless the dreamer decides to make it pass. The characters of Quahog do not age because the consciousness that generates them has not chosen to allow them to. This theory has the appeal of explaining the frozen clock without requiring any external mechanism. The answer to why doesn't anyone age is simply because the mind that creates this world doesn't want them to. It also explains why the world resets after catastrophes and why seemingly permanent changes are always undone eventually. The dreamer keeps choosing to return to a particular equilibrium. The second category of theory involves external intervention. The idea that something or someone outside the Griffin family has made a deliberate decision to keep the world frozen. In various iterations, this something is God. The show has a version of God, and he appears fairly regularly. Or some governmental or institutional body with access to technology that allows the manipulation of time, or, in the most science fiction-oriented version, an alien civilization that has placed the town of Quahog in a kind of specimen jar, observing it without allowing it to develop. The alien theory sounds outlandish, but has more support in the show's canon than you might expect. Family Guy has visited space, has introduced alien characters, has depicted extraterrestrial contact on multiple occasions. The show exists in a universe where alien life is an established fact, and there is something about the specific quality of Quahog's stasis. The way it is maintained so precisely, the way it absorbs and neutralizes absolutely any event that might otherwise disrupt its equilibrium, that suggests a kind of management. Something is keeping the snow globe intact. Something has decided that this particular community should remain exactly as it is. The third theory is the one that I find most compelling from a narrative standpoint, and it is the one that has been developing the most coherence in fan communities in recent years. It is sometimes called the convergence theory, and it goes like this. The show exists in a state of temporal convergence, a point where multiple alternative timelines have collapsed into a single, stable configuration. Stewie's use of the time machine over many seasons has created so many alterations to the timeline that at some point, at a point that may have already occurred within the show's narrative, without the audience being explicitly told, the timelines converged. They collapsed into each other, neutralizing each other's contradictions, and what remained was a kind of synthetic present, a version of the world that incorporates elements of all the timelines that fed into it, stabilized by their convergence, unable to develop further because development in any direction would require unraveling the convergence. In this reading, the frozen clock is not a failure or a punishment or a deliberate management decision. It is a consequence. It is what happens when a world has been through so many iterations that its natural temporal momentum has been exhausted. Quahog is not frozen because someone froze it. It is frozen because it has been through everything already, in one timeline or another, and the convergence of all those timelines has canceled out the possibility of genuine forward movement. This theory connects beautifully to the figure of Stewie, who is the engine of the time machine, and therefore the one most responsible for whatever temporal chaos has produced the current stasis. If the convergence theory is correct, then Stewie is both the source of the problem and the only being in the world with the tools to address it. He has the time machine. He can theoretically navigate the converged timelines and find a way to restore directional time, but he does not. And here's the question the theory raises. Does he know? Does Stewie understand, on some level, what he has done to his world? Is his ongoing megalomania a way of staying busy, staying distracted, avoiding the question of what the world would look like if time started moving again? Because if time started moving again in Quahog, things would change. And if things changed, the family on Spooner Street would not be the family on Spooner Street anymore. Meg would grow up and leave. Chris would grow up and leave. Peter and Lois would grow old. Stewie himself would become a toddler, then a child, then a teenager, then an adult. And whatever he is as an adult is something the show has visited in future timeline episodes, and what it shows us is not entirely reassuring. So perhaps the frozen clock is not something the characters suffer. Perhaps on some level that none of them could articulate, it is something they have chosen. The stillness of Spooner Street has its own particular beauty when you look at it this way. It is the beauty of a moment held open, a family at dinner still at the table, a neighborhood that never loses a house to age or economics, a show that keeps returning, episode after episode, to the same house, the same relationships, the same patterns. Not because it cannot imagine anything else, but because it has decided, somewhere deep in its hidden architecture, that this moment is worth preserving, even if it cannot say why. Section 8. Blink and you miss it. Easter eggs hidden in plain sight. There is a specific pleasure in pause button television, and Family Guy has been, for over 20 years, one of the most rewarding shows for the kind of viewer who keeps one hand on the remote and one eye on the background details. The animators on Family Guy have hidden things. Small things, large things, things that only make sense if you know something obscure, things that are blatant jokes for anyone paying close attention, but invisible to everyone else. Some of these Easter eggs are simple gags. Others feel like genuine communications, as if the people making the show are sending signals in the visual margin of the frame to the small percentage of viewers who are looking for them. Let us go through some of the most significant ones tonight, along with the theories they have generated. The newspaper gag is perhaps the most discussed category of hidden detail in Family Guy's history. The show frequently uses newspaper headlines in the background of scenes, placed where they can technically be read if you pause and look, but where they would never register in normal viewing speed. Some of these headlines are simple punchlines, jokes that extend and complicate the comedy of whatever is happening in the foreground. But others are strange. Some contain headlines that reference events from earlier or later in the same episode, creating a peculiar timeline effect, as if the newspaper exists slightly outside the normal flow of the scene, reporting on things that have not happened yet or that happened off-screen. One specific newspaper gag that generated a great deal of discussion involves a headline that reads, "When paused and zoomed, DVDs paused for headline joke. Millions disappointed." This is the show directly acknowledging the practice of pausing to read headlines. A moment of fourth wall dissolution so clean that it is hard to know whether to laugh or to feel caught. The show sees you pausing. It has planned for you pausing. And its response to your pausing is to tell you that the headline you pause to read is not worth reading. Or is it? Because the headline is clever enough to be worth reading, which means the show is both telling you the joke is worthless and making the joke worthwhile simultaneously. This is a particular kind of meta humor that Family Guy does better than almost any other show. The joke about the joke, which is itself a good joke, which then generates another joke about its own goodness. Another category of Easter egg involves background text that can only be read if you watch the show upside down or mirror the image. This sounds like the kind of thing that only obsessives would bother with, and you would be right. But the obsessives have been rewarded. There is a scene where a character runs away from something, and on the wall behind him, written in text that is visually inverted relative to the normal viewing angle, is the message, "If you can read this, your TV is upside down." The deliberateness of this is extraordinary. Someone sat down and animated text that would only be readable to a viewer who had literally turned their television screen upside down, and made sure the text acknowledged that fact. This is Easter egg craftsmanship at a level that deserves genuine appreciation. The background of the Griffin house is one of the richest fields for Easter egg hunting in the show. Specific objects recur in the background across different episodes and different seasons. Objects that appear to have been placed deliberately, often in positions that seem slightly too prominent to be truly accidental but too small to register without close attention. One example that fans have cataloged is a particular book title visible on the shelf in the Griffin's living room in certain episodes. The title, when paused and zoomed, appears to reference a book that does not exist. A fictional book title that, when you type it into a search engine, returns no results, which means someone made it up specifically to put it on that shelf. Why? Nobody knows for certain. The leading theory is that it is an internal reference, a joke shared among the production team, perhaps the title of a fake project or a nickname for someone on staff. But it sits there season after season in the background of family scenes, carrying its private meaning. The cutaway gags, which are one of the show's most distinctive structural features and one of its most debated stylistic choices, also contain their own category of Easter egg. Attentive viewers have noted that certain cutaway gags reference each other across episodes, that a cutaway in one season will set up a joke that pays off in a cutaway 2 seasons later. In what can only be intentional if someone was tracking this kind of long-form continuity very carefully. The famous chicken fight gags, which escalate over many seasons and have their own internal mythology, are the most obvious example of this kind of long-game Easter egg. But there are subtler versions, recurring visual motifs, repeated background characters, jokes that rhyme with earlier jokes in ways that reward the kind of viewer who has seen every episode multiple times. One of the most discussed long-form Easter eggs involves a recurring background character who appears in Quahog across many seasons. This character has been identified by dedicated fans through careful frame-by-frame analysis of crowd scenes and background moments. He is not given a name or any dialogue. He simply appears consistently in specific contexts, usually in moments of community gathering, public events, scenes where Quahog is collectively present in some way. The theory that has developed around him is essentially conspiratorial, that he is a deliberate signal placed by the animators to reward the most obsessive viewers, and that his consistent presence in community contexts is meant to suggest something about the nature of Quahog as a place. That it is watched, that it is managed, that someone or something is always paying attention to what happens there. This connects back, interestingly, to the alien intervention version of the frozen clock theory. The recurring background figure could be, In the theory's most elaborate form, a representative of whatever force is maintaining Quahog's stasis. A watcher placed in the crowd scenes, monitoring the experiment. The Simpson connection is another rich source of Easter eggs and theorizing. Family Guy and The Simpsons share a network, a genre, and a long history of mutual awareness. The shows have acknowledged each other, parodied each other, referenced each other, and eventually produced a full crossover episode. But the connections between the shows go deeper than the formal acknowledgments, and the Easter eggs that cross the boundary between the two series are among the most interesting in either show's history. Fans have cataloged a recurring pattern. In both shows, specific visual elements appear in the background of certain episodes that could only be meaningful if the viewer is simultaneously familiar with both series. A background object in a Family Guy episode mirrors an object that appeared in a Simpsons episode from years earlier. A design choice in a Quahog building echoes a design choice in Springfield's equivalent location. These could be coincidences. Both shows are animated in similar traditions. Both draw from the same cultural visual vocabulary of American suburban life. But the frequency and precision of the echoes has convinced many fans that at least some of them are deliberate. That the production teams were at certain points in conversation with each other across the boundary of their respective shows. The crossover episode itself, titled The Simpsons Guy, is a treasure chest of Easter eggs that reference both shows' histories. Beyond the obvious references, fans have identified background gags that are so specifically targeted at long-term viewers of both series that they can only be meaningful to someone who has watched both shows obsessively and retained information from seasons and episodes spanning decades. There is also a rich category of Easter egg involving the show's own history, moments where the current version of Family Guy references its own earlier, canceled, and resurrected self in ways that are more oblique than the direct fourth wall breaks. The show was canceled in 2002 after 3 seasons, and it came back in 2005 after extraordinarily strong DVD sales, demonstrated that the audience for the show was much larger than the live ratings had suggested. This cancellation and revival is one of the most discussed facts about Family Guy, and the show references it constantly and overtly. But the more interesting references are the ones that are hidden. The background details in post-revival episodes that gesture at something slightly different, something slightly more self-aware, than the show that was canceled. As if the return from cancellation changed the show in some way that it cannot fully articulate, but can only signal. One theory that has grown from this observation suggests that the Family Guy that was canceled and the Family Guy that returned are not quite the same show. That the cancellation functions within the show's mythology as a kind of death, and the revival as a kind of resurrection, and that the post-revival show contains encoded awareness of this, a knowledge buried in its Easter eggs and background details, that it has been somewhere and come back, and that the world it returned to is not quite the same as the one it left. There is something almost poignant about this if you hold it lightly. The show that died and came back, placing quiet signs of that experience in the margins of its episodes. The show that knows it was canceled and keeps referencing that knowledge in the background, where most viewers will never notice, as if the knowledge is too significant to suppress but too complicated to say directly. The Easter eggs of Family Guy are, in the end, a record of the show talking to itself. They are the conversations that the production team is having with the most obsessive segment of the audience. Conversations that happen in visual parentheses, in background text too small to read without pausing, in recurring figures and echoing motifs and jokes that only land if you have seen everything before. They are the show demonstrating, quietly and persistently, that it is more aware of itself and its history and its world than it usually lets on. Which, when you think about it, is the best possible argument for spending 3 hours watching someone talk about Family Guy theories in the dark. Section 9. The Peter Griffin Delusion. Is the whole show in his head? Everything we have discussed tonight, the purgatory theory, the convergence theory, the solipsism theory, all of them circle around a central question that the boldest and most ambitious Family Guy theory addresses directly. What if the entire show is a hallucination, a dream, or a delusion produced by a single specific mind? And what if that mind belongs to Peter Griffin? The Peter Griffin delusion theory has been circulating in fan communities for over a decade, and it has the quality of a good conspiracy theory. The more you look for evidence against it, the more you end up finding evidence for it instead. It is not airtight, it has gaps and contradictions. But it provides a framework that makes the weirdest, most inexplicable elements of Family Guy, the ones that no other theory quite addresses, suddenly coherent. Here is the core proposition. Peter Griffin is a man of below-average intelligence living in a world that consistently rewards intelligence, status, and competence in ways he does not meet the threshold for. He loves his family but is frequently inadequate as a father and husband. He has friends, but his friendship is often a burden to them. He has a job that he values, but that places him in subordinate relationship to people he fundamentally does not understand. He is, by the ordinary standards of the world he inhabits, a marginal figure. A man who has somehow ended up with a life that the world around him implicitly suggests he did not quite earn. In this real-world Peter, the Peter beneath the cartoon, the Peter whose psychology we are attempting to reconstruct, there is an enormous gap between who he is and who he wants to be. He wants to be the hero of his story. He wants to be the man at the center of things, the one everyone is watching, the one whose opinions matter and whose adventures are meaningful. He wants to be special. The delusion theory suggests that Family Guy is what happens when that gap is filled by fantasy. That Peter's mind, in some version of the story, has produced a world in which he is, in fact, the center of everything, in which his opinions always eventually matter, even if they have to be delivered through comedy to be acceptable, in which his adventures, however ridiculous, are always the most important thing happening, in which celebrities visit Quahog to interact with him personally, in which wars are fought, families are threatened, social structures are overturned, and supernatural entities visit, all more or less in relation to Peter and his immediate circle. Think about how Quahog functions in the show. It is an entire city, with hundreds of thousands of inhabitants, and yet the story consistently returns to the same small group of people on and around Spooner Street. Occasionally a new character enters the orbit and stays for a while, but the world contracts back, reliably, to Peter and his immediate family and neighbors. The city exists, but it exists as background, as context. The only things that fully materialize, fully develop, fully matter, are the things that touch Peter directly. This is not how reality works, but it is exactly how ego works. In a mind producing a world to make itself the center of things, the world would be vast in suggestion but intimate in practice. There would be constant references to an enormous, complex world outside, a world full of history and politics and culture and events. But the actual experience of living in that world would always reduce to the familiar small circle. You would know that China exists, that celebrities exist, that history has happened, because your mind knows these things and includes them for verisimilitude. But you would never actually encounter the vastness of the world except when it came to visit you. This is Quahog. The celebrities who visit Quahog do not come there for reasons that make sense on their own terms. They come there because Peter's mind wants them there. The historical events that intersect with Peter's life do not do so by coincidence. They do so because in Peter's fantasy, history bends in his direction. The recurring cast of characters who populate Spooner Street are not independent beings with their own full lives. They are the specific people Peter's mind needs to have around him, performing the functions he requires. Quagmire exists to be the friend who validates Peter's desirability and social standing. Joe exists to be the friend who is visibly worse off than Peter in some respects, providing reassurance. Cleveland exists to be the friend who is patient and good-natured and always available. Lois exists to be the woman who loves Peter despite everything. The children exist to be evidence of Peter's legacy. And the villains, the antagonists who appear in various forms across the show, exist to be defeated by Peter, to confirm that he is ultimately adequate for the challenges life presents. The delusion theory also offers the most coherent explanation for the show's treatment of time. A mind producing a sustained fantasy does not maintain strict chronological continuity. It circles, it repeats. It revisits the same scenes and relationships because those scenes and relationships are the ones that provide the specific psychological satisfactions the mind is seeking. Peter's fantasy keeps returning to the dinner table, to the drunken clam, to the front yard of the Griffin house. Not because anything is keeping it there mechanically, but because these are the settings where Peter's mind gets what it needs. And the cutaway gags, the random tangents, the cultural references, the completely non-sequitur moments that interrupt the main narrative, these in the delusion theory are the stray thoughts of Peter's mind. They are the way his consciousness processes the world, associatively, impulsively, following chains of connection that are entirely private and internal. When a scene triggers a cutaway, what you are witnessing is Peter's mind going where it goes, following its own logic, before snapping back to the story. This also explains the show's inconsistency in a way that the "it's just a cartoon" explanation does not quite capture. A mind does not maintain perfect continuity. A mind misremembers. A mind revises its own history. A mind will tell you that Meg has a specific birthday in one story and a completely different birthday in another. Not because the facts have changed, but because the mind holding the facts is not a database. It is a human consciousness, approximate and personal and shaped by emotion rather than accuracy. The question the delusion theory inevitably raises is, where is the real Peter? What is happening in the non-fantasy world while his mind produces Quahog? The most common answer offered by the fan community is one of three possibilities. The first is that Peter is in some form of medical state. Comatose, perhaps, following an accident that the show has not explicitly depicted, but that can be inferred from certain visual clues that theorists have identified. The second is that Peter is in a psychiatric facility, and the world of the show is the world his mind produces within that confinement. The third and most narratively elegant is that Peter is simply asleep, that Family Guy is literally, structurally, a dream, and that the events of the show are the dreams that Peter has in his sleeping hours when the life he actually has is replaced by the life he would prefer. This third option has a particular appeal for a video like this one, where many of you are watching in a half-asleep state, allowing the narration to carry you down into the comfortable warmth of almost sleep. The idea that Family Guy is a dream. Peter's dream, elaborate and consistent and governed by its own internal logic, makes the show's comfort food quality make sense in a new way. It does not just feel like a dream because it is soothing and familiar and consequence-free. It feels like a dream because it is one. The most poignant version of the Peter delusion theory involves what Peter's actual life might look like. The life beneath the dream. Some fans have speculated about this in quite moving detail. The real Peter in these speculations is a man who loves his family genuinely and imperfectly, who tries and fails and tries again, who goes to work and comes home and watches television and worries about money, who is, in most of the ways that matter, completely ordinary, and who finds in his dreams a version of himself that is extraordinary, not because he is smarter or more capable or more heroic, but because in the dream, what he does matters. He is the main character. The world notices him. It is in the end a very human fantasy, and it is carried, in this theory, by a very human dreamer. Section 10, The Bonnie Swanson, Mystery and Other Neighborhood Secrets. There is a pregnancy in Family Guy that lasted 9 years. Not 9 months. 9 years. Bonnie Swanson, the wife of Joe Swanson, the paraplegic police officer who lives across the street from the Griffins, was introduced as a pregnant woman in the show's very first season. She remained visibly, obviously heavily pregnant across 116 episodes. 116. She finally gave birth in a season 7 episode titled Ocean's 3.5 in 2009, approximately 9 years after the pregnancy began. The baby, a girl named Susie, was born healthy. She is voiced in one of the show's most quietly wonderful pieces of casting by Patrick Stewart, the distinguished British actor, performing the internal thoughts of an infant girl in a cartoon about a dysfunctional Rhode Island family. In the tradition of Stewie, whose thoughts are articulate and complex in ways that nobody around him can perceive, Susie Swanson's inner world is narrated by one of the most gravely beautiful voices in the history of English language performance. It is funny. It is also, if you think about it at 2 in the morning, genuinely strange and lovely. But Bonnie's 9-year pregnancy is not a throwaway joke. It is one of the most extensively documented examples of the show's peculiar relationship with time, and it has generated a remarkable amount of theorizing. The most literal explanation, the floating timeline, the show's refusal to let time pass in any conventional way, accounts for the pregnancy mathematically if you apply the same logic we discussed in the frozen clock section. If time in Quahog does not pass in a linear way, then a pregnancy can last as long as the narrative needs it to last, which in Bonnie's case was apparently 9 years. The pregnancy was a background detail, a consistent visual joke, something that defined Bonnie's presence in scenes without ever demanding resolution. The show was comfortable letting it sit there, unresolved for nearly a decade of broadcast time. But the theorists want to know why. Not why in terms of the show's production logic, like that is obvious, but why in terms of the show's internal mythology. What does it mean within the world of Quahog for a pregnancy to last 9 years? The most haunting version of the answer comes from the theory that frames Quahog as a kind of suspended world. In a place where time does not pass, where cycles repeat and change cannot fully take hold, what would pregnancy mean? Pregnancy is, by definition, a state of becoming. Something is in the process of happening. There is a before and an after, a beginning and an end, a direction of movement. In a world that resists directional movement, pregnancy would be infinite. The baby would always be almost here. The change would always be almost arrived. Bonnie's 9-year pregnancy in this reading is the show's most extended metaphor for its own condition. Always pregnant with change, never quite giving birth to it. There is a second reading that has gained traction among fans who focus on Bonnie's character specifically, independent of the temporal theory. In this reading, Bonnie's extended pregnancy is a psychological condition as much as a physical one. Bonnie is, across most of the show's run, one of the most emotionally opaque characters in the cast. She is present in neighborhood scenes, she participates in conversations, but she rarely drives plot or expresses strong preference. She exists, for most of the show, in a state of waiting. Waiting for the baby, waiting for her situation with Joe to resolve or improve, waiting for something to change. The pregnancy is the external expression of this interior stasis. She is full of potential change that has not yet arrived. When Susie is finally born, Bonnie's character does change slightly. She becomes more assertive, more willing to act on her own dissatisfactions rather than simply absorbing them. In one of the more surprising later season storylines, Bonnie has an affair, experiences serious marital conflict with Joe, and demonstrates a depth of feeling and a willingness to pursue her own needs that was entirely absent from her earlier presentation. The theory suggests that the birth of Susie was what unlocked this, that Bonnie needed to complete the pregnancy, to deliver the change she had been carrying for 9 years before she could begin to move. Joe Swanson's situation is connected to Bonnie's, but has its own entirely separate theoretical dimension that deserves attention. Joe was introduced in Season 1 as the impressive, capable police officer who leaves Peter feeling inadequate. He uses a wheelchair, the result of injuries sustained in the line of duty, but his disability in the early seasons is presented as something he has transcended rather than something that defines him. He is strong, respected, and admired. Peter is, genuinely and without irony, jealous of Joe's status. Over the course of the show, Joe's character undergoes a transformation that mirrors, in some ways, Peter's own decline, but in a direction that is almost the opposite of Peter's. Where Peter becomes more aggressive and less constrained, Joe becomes quieter and more marginalized. His disability, which was initially a symbol of the challenges he had overcome, becomes increasingly the butt of jokes. His competence is undercut, his marriage suffers, his friendships with Peter and Quagmire, which were genuine and warm in the early seasons, become more complicated, more ambivalent, more prone to cruelty on the part of the other characters. The theory that best accounts for Joe's trajectory is one that reads it as the show's most extended, if inadvertent, commentary on the way institutions treat people with disabilities over time. Joe is celebrated when he is visibly performing competence. When he is doing police work, showing physical strength, refusing to let his wheelchair slow him down. He is diminished when he is simply present, existing in the world without performing anything. The message the show ends up communicating, regardless of intention, is that respect is contingent on performance. When Joe stops being an inspirational figure and starts being a person with ordinary problems and ordinary vulnerabilities, the world of the show has less space for him. The fan theory that has developed most interestingly around Joe is one that connects his arc to the Purgatory framework. In the Purgatory reading, each character is working through something, a specific unresolved tension that keeps them cycling. Joe's tension is the gap between who he was before his injury and who he is now. He was an active, physically dominant presence in the world, and his identity was built around that physical capability. The injury took something that was central to his sense of self, and in Purgatory, you keep being confronted with the thing you have not resolved. Joe is therefore, in this reading, perpetually negotiating with the loss, cycling between acceptance and grief, between the version of himself that has made peace with who he is now and the version that cannot quite stop measuring itself against who he was. The show's treatment of his disability oscillates in exactly this way, sometimes presenting it as something Joe has integrated into a full and functional identity, and sometimes using it as the engine of jokes that reopen the wound rather than close it. There are other neighborhood secrets worth surfacing before we move on, because Spooner Street contains more hidden depth than a single section can exhaust. The Brown family, Cleveland, Loretta, and later Cleveland Jr., represents a strand of the show's history that is complicated by the fact that Cleveland eventually got his own spin-off series, The Cleveland Show, which ran from 2009 to 2013, and then saw Cleveland return to Quahog. The theory that has developed around Cleveland's departure and return involves what his time away did to the neighborhood's dynamics. Quahog is presented as a stable system, but it is a stable system that required Cleveland's presence to function in a specific way. Without Cleveland, certain kinds of conversations could not happen. Certain social dynamics were missing. His return restored something that even the characters who did not consciously miss him had been subtly lacking. The most interesting Cleveland theory, however, involves the running gag of his bathtub. In multiple episodes, Cleveland is shown being forcibly ejected from his home in his bathtub, usually as a result of Peter or some other external force destroying the wall or floor beneath him. He falls naked in his tub into the yard. Every time he shouts the same startled exclamation. It is a recurring gag, one of the show's most reliable bits of physical comedy, and its repetition is so consistent that it has achieved a kind of ritual quality. The theory. The bathtub gag is not just a gag, it is a signal. Every time Cleveland falls from his house in his bathtub, something is resetting in the Quahog system. The falls mark moments of narrative disruption. Not always obvious ones, but moments where something has shifted in the story that requires a symbolic acknowledgement. Cleveland's involuntary departure from his tub is, in this reading, the show's equivalent of a cosmic reset button, played for laughs to disguise its actual function. This sounds elaborate. It also sounds exactly like the kind of thing the Family Guy writing staff would plant, knowing that someone would eventually find it and turn it into a theory, which is perhaps the deepest Easter egg of all. Section 11. The Star Wars Connection and the Show Within the Show. Family Guy has produced 3 full-length parody episodes dedicated to the Star Wars saga. Blue Harvest, in Season 6, adapted the original Star Wars film with the Griffin family cast in the major roles. It was followed by Something, 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 Darkside in Season 8, adapting The Empire Strikes Back. And then It's a Trap in Season 9, adapting Return of the Jedi. These 3 episodes represent some of the most technically ambitious and culturally detailed work the show has ever done. They required extensive negotiation with Lucasfilm, meticulous attention to the specific visual and musical language of the films they were parodying, and a level of craft that exceeded the production standards of most regular Family Guy episodes. But beyond being impressive parodies, these episodes are theoretically interesting in ways that have nothing to do with Star Wars itself. The framing device for all 3 Star Wars episodes is a blackout, a power cut, that forces the Griffin family to sit together in their darkened living room with nothing to do. Peter suggests telling a story, and the story he tells is the Star Wars trilogy, with the family cast in the roles. Chris is Luke Skywalker. Lois is Princess Leia. Peter is Han Solo. Brian is Chewbacca. Stewie is Darth Vader. Herbert the town's elderly resident with an inappropriate interest in young boys is the Emperor, and various other Quahog characters fill out the remaining cast. The casting is not arbitrary. The characters do not play their Star Wars roles by accident. They play the roles that reflect their dynamics in the actual show. Peter plays Han Solo because Peter, like Han, is a charismatic, fundamentally likable figure who operates outside formal structures and whose selfishness is always eventually outweighed by his loyalty. Chris plays Luke because Chris, like Luke, is the earnest son who wants to be good and who carries a potential greatness that nobody, including himself, has quite figured out how to unlock. And Stewie plays Darth Vader because Stewie, like Vader, is a being of enormous power and dark impulse who is, beneath the villainy, someone's child. Someone who was once capable of something more than what he became. The theory that has grown around the Star Wars episodes involves the casting of Stewie as Vader in a specific and meaningful way. In the Star Wars mythology, Darth Vader is Luke Skywalker's father. In the Family Guy casting, Stewie is Peter's son. But the show places Stewie in the Vader role and Chris in the Luke role, which creates an interesting inversion. Stewie, the son, is playing the father. Chris, the other son, is playing the son who confronts and ultimately redeems his father. Peter, the actual father, is playing the man who is not the father. This inversion is either a coincidence of casting or a deliberate signal about the relationships within the Griffin family. The theory suggests the latter. It suggests that the Star Wars episodes are the show's most extended meditation on the father-son dynamics within the Griffin household. Dynamics that are normally handled obliquely or for comedy, but that in the Star Wars framework can be approached directly, because the mythological scaffolding of Star Wars provides cover for the emotional truth. In this reading, Stewie as Vader is the show acknowledging something it cannot say in a regular episode. That Stewie, for all his intelligence and all his power, is fundamentally shaped by his relationship with Peter. That the dark side of Stewie's character, the megalomania, the aggression, the compensatory need for control, is the dark side of being Peter Griffin's son. And that the possibility of Stewie's redemption, like Vader's, lies in the same direction as the recognition of what he actually is. Not a conqueror, but someone's child. The Star Wars episodes also contain some of the show's most densely packed Easter egg sequences, which makes sense given that they are themselves engaged in the meta-activity of parroting a canonical text. But some of the Easter eggs in these episodes go beyond the obvious visual references to the films being parodied, gesturing at internal Family Guy mythology in ways that reward the viewer who has been paying attention to the regular series. One of the most discussed is a background detail in Blue Harvest, where, during a crowd scene set in the Mos Eisley Cantina equivalent, several background characters are briefly visible who do not correspond to any Star Wars alien species, but instead correspond to recurring background characters from regular Family Guy episodes. They are there for just a few frames. Most viewers would never register them, but they are there, sitting at the bar in a galaxy far, far away, drinking whatever aliens drink, fully costumed in species-appropriate makeup, but unmistakably the same people who are usually visible in the background of the drunken clam. The theory: the background characters of Quahog are not specific to Quahog. They travel with the story. They are not inhabitants of a place, but inhabitants of a narrative. And whatever narrative the show decides to enter, these figures come along. They are the permanent supporting cast of Peter Griffin's universe, present in the galaxy of Star Wars just as they are present in the streets of Rhode Island, because the universe they inhabit is wherever Peter's story is being told. This connects beautifully to the Peter delusion theory, and to the convergence theory, and to the purgatory framework. All of these theories share an underlying architecture. The idea that the world of Family Guy is a story, and that the people within it are participants in a story rather than inhabitants of a reality. The Star Wars episodes are the moments when this architecture becomes most visible, when the show is most nakedly a story performing itself, when the meta level and the narrative level collapse into each other most completely. There is a secondary connection to Star Wars that operates at the level of the show's philosophy rather than its specific episodes, and it involves the way both Star Wars and Family Guy handle the relationship between good and evil. Star Wars operates on a dualistic moral framework that its later iterations have complicated but never fully abandoned. There is a light side and a dark side. Strength comes from balance, but the choice between light and dark is real and consequential. Characters can fall and can be redeemed, and the redemption arc is the emotional center of the mythology. Family Guy, in its more thoughtful moments, gestures at a similar framework. Peter is not simply bad, he contains better impulses that are consistently defeated by worse ones. Brian is not simply insufferable, he contains genuine wisdom and genuine kindness that are consistently undercut by his ego. Stewie is not simply evil. He contains the capacity for deep love and deep loyalty that are consistently suppressed by his compensatory aggression. Every major character in Family Guy is, in the Star Wars sense, someone who has not yet fully chosen their side. The theory this suggests, one of the more expansive ideas in the Family Guy fan community, is that the show's entire arc, viewed from a sufficient distance, is a redemption story. That what looks like repetitive, consequence-free cycling is actually a very slow, very gradual movement toward something, toward moments of genuine choice, genuine change, genuine resolution of the unresolved tensions that keep the characters in their loops. That the cycles are not without direction. They are spiraling, slowly and almost imperceptibly, toward a moment when Peter will actually learn something, when Brian will actually tell the truth, when Stewie will actually choose to be what he is rather than perform what he thinks he needs to be. Whether the show will ever reach that moment is a different question. The April 2025 renewal through Season 27 suggests that the story will keep going for at least several more years. But the movement is there, if you believe in it. The spiral is slow, but it is not stationary. And somewhere in the background of every episode, the anonymous Quahog regulars are sitting at the bar, in whatever bar happens to be the bar this week, patiently waiting for whatever comes next. Section 12. The Darkest Corners. Theories that change. Everything we have been building toward this section all night. Everything that came before. The purgatory, the delusion, the convergence, the Easter eggs, the frozen clock, has been preparation for the theories that live in the darkest corners of the Family Guy fan community. The ones that are not comfortable. The ones that require you to look at the show you have been watching for years and accept that it might be doing something much more complicated, much more disquieting than you ever suspected. These theories do not all fit together neatly. They do not form a unified cosmology. They are the edge cases, the outliers, the ideas that individual fans or small communities have developed and that the broader conversation has not fully absorbed. But each of them contains something genuine, a real insight, a real observation about the show, a real question that the show seems to be asking without wanting to answer. Let us begin with the theory about Brian and the nature of consciousness in Quahog. Brian Griffin is a dog. We have established this. He is a dog who functions as a person, and the ontological strangeness of his situation is one of the show's most consistent sources of comedy and pathos. But there is a dimension of Brian's existence that the show has never fully addressed, and that the darkest fan theories find deeply significant. The question of whether Brian is conscious in the same way that the human characters are conscious, or whether his consciousness is something different, something partial, something provisional, something that the world of the show accommodates without fully acknowledging. The theory goes like this. In the world of Quahog, humans are real in a specific, stable sense. They have full interiority. They have memories, consistent identities, stable relationships with each other that persist across time. But Brian's status as a being is different. He is the only non-human who functions as a person. And this uniqueness is not explained by the show, it is simply accepted as one of the axioms of the world. No other animal in Quahog functions as Brian does. Occasionally other talking animals appear, but They are always presented as exceptional or comedic exceptions. Brian is the only constant. The question the theory asks is, what is Brian made of in terms of the world's logic? And the answer it proposes is that Brian is not a fully independent being. He is a projection. He is the moral and intellectual conscience of the Griffin household made flesh, or rather made fur. He is what happens when a family like the Griffins unconsciously generates the external representation of the qualities they collectively lack: self-awareness, intellectual honesty, emotional intelligence, loyalty that is genuine rather than transactional. In this reading, Brian's inconsistencies are not characterization failures. They are the natural instability of a projection. When the family is functioning better, Brian behaves better. When the family is at its most selfish, most chaotic, most disconnected from its own best impulses, Brian behaves at his worst. He reflects the family's moral condition rather than operating independently of it. He is a barometer. This would explain something that fans often note about Brian's worst behavior. It tends to cluster around periods in the show when the Griffin family as a whole is at its most dysfunctional. The seasons where Peter is most cruel are also the seasons where Brian is most insufferable. The seasons where Lois is most disengaged are the seasons where Brian is most self-absorbed. The connection is not coincidental in this theory. It is the show's hidden architecture, operating in the background, maintaining the logical coherence of a world that looks chaotic on the surface. The second dark corner theory involves the audience. Family Guy is one of the most meta-aware shows in the history of American television. It breaks the fourth wall constantly, references its own existence as a television program, acknowledges the presence of viewers, makes jokes about the process of making the show. This is all presented as comedy, why as the show being clever and self-aware and willing to wink at the people watching. But the theory suggests that the fourth wall breaking in Family Guy is not quite what it presents itself as. It is not the show being playful with a narrative convention. It is the show being genuinely aware of something. Aware of being observed, aware of being watched, aware that there are people on the other side of whatever boundary the characters exist behind. And that awareness is not comfortable. In the darkest version of the theory, it is desperate. Consider the moments when Family Guy breaks the fourth wall in ways that go beyond the playful wink. The moments when a character turns to the camera and the look in their eye is not quite the look of a comedian delivering a punchline. It is something more complicated. Something that registers, however briefly, the fundamental strangeness of being a character in a story, being watched by people who exist in a different order of reality from the one you inhabit. There is an episode where Brian, in the context of a conversation about the meaninglessness of existence, turns and addresses the audience directly. He asks, without apparent comedic intent, whether the people watching him understand that what they are watching is not real. He then pulls back from this and makes it a joke. But the moment before the joke, the moment of genuine question, is brief and odd and sits in the memory in a way that pure comedy usually does not. The theory that grows from this observation is sometimes called the awareness theory. It suggests that certain characters in Family Guy, Brian primarily, but also Stewie and occasionally Meg, have developed some form of awareness that they are fictional, that they exist in a story, that there are people watching them, and that this awareness, which they cannot fully act on and cannot fully escape, is a source of genuine existential distress that the show never addresses directly, because to address it directly would be to break something fundamental about the structure of the narrative. This is a theory that has philosophical antecedents going back centuries. The idea of fictional characters who become aware of their own fictionality is one of the most durable concepts in literature and philosophy. But Family Guy does something specific with it that most fictional explorations of the concept do not. It lets the awareness be half-formed. It lets the characters approach it and retreat from it. Brian seems sometimes to almost know, and then the scene changes, and Brian is making a joke about wine, and the moment passes. The third dark corner theory is the one that most completely reframes the show's tone, and it is the one I want to leave you with as tonight winds toward sleep. This theory begins with Meg. Specifically, it begins with the episode we discussed much earlier in our time together. the season 10 episode that has become one of the most analyzed episodes in the show's history. The one where Meg finally confronts her family, names everything they have done to her, and then voluntarily returns to being the family's punching bag because doing otherwise would cause the family to collapse. Most analysis of this episode focuses on what it says about Meg, that she is the family's scapegoat, that her suffering is structural rather than incidental, that she has made a terrible peace with her own mistreatment. All of this is true, but the theory that lives in the darkest corner takes a different angle. It asks, what does Meg's self-sacrifice mean for the other characters? If Meg is the one absorbing the family's dysfunction, if her willingness to be the target prevents the rest of the Griffins from having to confront their own worst qualities, then what are the Griffins in the absence of Meg's sacrifice? What do they become without her? The episode shows us briefly. When Meg withdraws her usual role, the family turns on each other with a speed and ferocity that is genuinely disturbing. Peter, Lois, Chris, Brian, the people who have been united by their shared mistreatment of Meg, begin to savage each other instead. The warmth of the family, such as it is, dissolves almost instantly. What is revealed beneath the surface is not a difficult but loving group of people who have been coping badly with their dysfunction. What is revealed is something much bleaker, a family whose only source of cohesion is a shared cruelty, and whose relationships with each other are mediated by their collective ability to feel superior to someone. Without Meg, the Griffins are nothing to each other. Without someone beneath them, they cannot maintain the illusion that they are adequate as a family, as parents, as people. Meg holds the whole structure together by being its foundation. And the foundation, in this structure, is the person who takes the weight. The theory that emerges from this observation is one that reframes every previous season of Family Guy. Every joke at Meg's expense, every casual cruelty, every moment of dismissal, these are not entertainment. They are the maintenance of a system. They are the regular, repeated acts through which the Griffins sustain their own sense of adequacy. Without Meg's apparent inadequacy to measure themselves against, they would have to face their own. This is why Meg cannot change, why her victories do not stick, why the reset button is pressed so consistently after any episode that gives her genuine agency or dignity. It is not narrative laziness. It is the structural necessity of a system that requires her to remain where she is. The system does not want Meg to grow. The system has decided that it cannot afford for Meg to grow. And Meg knows this. She has always known this. Her acceptance of her role in the season 10 episode is not weakness. It is the most sophisticated act of self-awareness in the entire show. She has understood the system. She has understood what she is in it. And she has made a choice, however terrible, however costly, to remain within it rather than destroy it. That choice deserves to be recognized as what it is. One of the most quietly heroic things any character in Family Guy has ever done. Because here's the thing that all of our theories tonight, across all of these hours, have been circling around without quite saying. Family Guy is a show about people who cannot escape. They cannot escape their patterns, their relationships, their frozen town, their looping time. They cannot escape each other. They are in every framework we have explored tonight: purgatory, delusion, convergence, constructed world, trapped, held in place by forces they cannot see and do not understand. And in the middle of all of this, Meg Griffin makes a choice to stay. She makes a choice to keep absorbing the weight of a family that cannot see her clearly. She makes a choice to maintain a world that punishes her for existing in it. That is not a punchline. That is not the setup for a joke. That is a character carrying something real and carrying it with a quiet dignity that the show almost never acknowledges. She carries it so the rest of them don't have to. And somewhere in Quahog, in a town that does not age, in a house that does not change, in a family that does not remember what they learned last week, Meg Griffin is still carrying it. She has been carrying it for 25 years. Closing, the night winding down. We have covered a lot of ground tonight. We have walked through the bones of a world that should not exist but does, examining the theories that have grown up around it like ivy on a wall that nobody built on purpose, but that has become, over time, something genuinely beautiful. We have sat with the Griffins through their purgatory and their paralysis, their hidden depths and their unresolvable tensions. We have spent time with Stewie, who is too smart for his world and too small for his ambitions. With Brian, who is too aware for his happiness and too flawed for his self-image. With Peter, who might be dreaming all of it, who might be the dreamer who invented Quahog because the real world did not offer him enough room to be himself. With Meg, who sees the system clearly and pays the price for that clarity every single day. With Quagmire, who may have been alive since 1948, and who carries whatever that means without letting anyone look at it too closely. With Bonnie, whose 9-year pregnancy was the world refusing to let change arrive. With Joe, who is perpetually negotiating with loss. With Brian again, because Brian always comes back, even when he does not mean to. We have looked at the Easter eggs hidden in the margins of the frame, the upside-down text, the newspaper jokes, the background characters who appear in different galaxies, the book titles that reference things only the production team knows. We have examined the Star Wars episodes as mythology rather than parody. We have considered what the Purgatory framework does to every piece of the show's humor, whether the cutaway gags are the thoughts of a dreaming man, or the detritus of souls trapped in repetition. None of this changes what Family Guy is. It is a cartoon about a fictional family in a fictional town, full of jokes, full of cutaways, full of cultural references that age at wildly different rates, and a voice cast that has been performing the same characters for a quarter of a century. It is a commercial product. It was renewed through season 27 in April of 2025. It will keep being made. But it is also the thing we have been exploring tonight. A world with hidden rooms and unexpected depths. A show that rewards the people who look closely with something worth finding. A comedy that has been, all along, running a second conversation beneath the first one about impermanence and love and what it costs to hold a family together. That second conversation is what we have been having tonight, and I hope it has been good company for whatever part of the night you are in right now. If this video has given you something to think about, or better still, if it has given you something to drift off with, please do hit subscribe, leave a like, and let us know in the comments what part of the night or day you are in and what your favorite theory from tonight is. These long-form sessions are built for the quiet hours, and knowing you are out there in them, wherever you are in the world, matters more than you might think. We will be back. And when we are, there will be more worlds to look at carefully, more shows to take apart gently, more theories to sit with in the dark. For now, rest well, sleep easy. And somewhere in Quahog, the Griffins are still at the dinner table, and Meg is still there, and the clock is still frozen, and Brian is almost finished writing his novel, and Stewie is planning something that will probably not happen, and Peter is watching television and laughing at something that does not quite make sense. And the street is quiet, and the lights are on in every house, and nothing is about to change. Which means, in the strange logic of Spooner Street, that everything is fine. Section 13. The hidden language of Quahog. How the town talks to itself. Every world that has existed long enough develops its own private language. Not a formal language, not one that any character ever sits down to learn, but an accumulation of recurring symbols, repeated gestures, visual rhymes, and narrative echoes that the world uses to talk to itself across time. Springfield has its language. Bedrock had one. The world of Family Guy has built one over 25 years of continuous operation, and it is more sophisticated and more coherent than the show's reputation for randomness would suggest. The private language of Quahog operates on several registers simultaneously. There is the visual register, the way certain colors, certain objects, certain spatial configurations appear repeatedly in ways that are not quite coincidental. There is the narrative register, the recurring plot structures, the scenes that rhyme with earlier scenes, the ways that certain kinds of conflict always resolve in certain kinds of ways regardless of the specific characters involved. And there is the emotional register, the show's consistent grammar for communicating feeling, which it deploys across wildly different comedic contexts with a consistency that you only notice once you have been watching long enough to have seen it more than once. Let us begin with color, because color is the most immediate and the most often overlooked form of visual communication in any animated series. The Griffin House at 31 Spooner Street is decorated in a palette that has remained remarkably consistent across the show's entire run. The living room where the family spends most of their time is a specific shade of warm gold beige. Not quite yellow, not quite orange, but a color that sits in the zone between the two, that communicates something between domesticity and stasis. The furniture is brown, the carpet is a muted pattern, the walls are the color of old paper. This is not a palette that suggests vitality or change. It is the palette of a place that has settled, that has accepted what it is, that is not expecting to be redecorated. Compare this to the colors used when the show takes the characters outside the home, particularly into situations of genuine adventure or consequence. The colors become sharper, more saturated, more contrastive. The world outside Spooner Street is a more visually alive world. It has more range, more extremity, more of the visual markers that signal importance and significance. And then the characters come home, and the palette settles back into that warm, muted, domestic beige, and the visual world communicates, we are back where we belong, and nothing has changed. This is the show's visual grammar for the frozen clock. The house does not change its colors because the house does not change. The home is the constant against which all adventures are measured, and the constant is expressed visually in a palette so steady and so consistent that it registers as comfort rather than stasis, which may be exactly the point. The Drunken Clam, the bar where Peter and his friends spend most of their social time, uses a different but equally consistent palette. Darker, warmer, more amber, the color of beer and old wood, and the specific particular quality of light that happens in a bar at 9 o'clock on a weeknight when nobody is in a hurry to leave. This is the palette of male friendship as Family Guy understands it. Slightly dim, slightly warm, slightly removed from the full brightness of ordinary life. The Drunken Clam is not quite real in the same way the Griffin House is real. It is a slightly heightened, slightly idealized version of what a bar can be, which is why it functions as the setting for so many of the show's most emotionally honest moments, alongside its most purely comic ones. The spatial geography of Quahog is also worth attending to. The neighborhood of Spooner Street is spatially impossible. The houses are both adjacently close, in the way that suburban American homes are, and somehow also capable of containing enormous events, conflicts, and adventures without the neighbors noticing. Explosions happen in the Griffin backyard and the Swansons do not look up from dinner. Elaborate constructions appear and disappear. The physical world of Spooner Street absorbs what it needs to absorb and erases what it needs to erase, with a consistency that the convergence theory finds significant. The neighborhood resets because it needs to reset in order to maintain the conditions of the story. The spatial theory that has gotten the most traction involves the relationship between the Griffin House and the Quahog Town Center. They are presented across different episodes as being at wildly different distances from each other. Sometimes the Griffins can walk to the town center in what appears to be minutes. Other times, getting there requires a car journey. The school that Meg and Chris attend shifts in its apparent distance and direction from episode to episode. The brewery where Peter works is sometimes close enough to be reached in a few minutes, and sometimes appears to require a significant commute. The theory: the geography of Quahog is not fixed because it is responsive. It adjusts to the needs of the narrative. When the story needs Peter to arrive somewhere quickly, Quahog contracts. When the story needs distance, when a character needs to be separated from the rest of the cast for narrative purposes, the town expands to accommodate that separation. The town is a story-responsive space rather than a geographically coherent one. This is another way of arriving at the conclusion that Quahog is not a real place. But the interesting angle the geography theory adds is the suggestion that Quahog is not even a fixed construct. It is a dynamic one, continuously adjusting itself to serve the story being told within it. The town does not have a map. It has a mood, and the mood shapes the space in real time. The recurring structural patterns of the show constitute another layer of its private language. Family Guy has a set of narrative moves that it makes with such regularity that viewers who have watched long enough can anticipate them, even when they cannot predict the specific content. There is the structure where Peter does something reckless and gets away with it, and then does something reckless again and does not get away with it. and the consequences of the second thing occupy the rest of the episode. There is the structure where a new character enters the orbit of Spooner Street, disrupts the established dynamics, and is then removed, often abruptly, in a way that the remaining characters barely register. There is the structure where Stewie and Brian go somewhere together and something unexpected about themselves is revealed in the context of that journey. There is the structure where Meg attempts to change her situation, comes close to succeeding, and then has the change undone. These structures are so consistent that they constitute, in the theory community's reading, a grammar. And like any grammar, they communicate meaning through their form as well as their content. The Meg structure, for instance, communicates something about power and system every time it repeats, regardless of the specific episode it appears in. The repetition of the structure is itself the message, that some things do not change, that certain forces in the world are too large for individual effort to overcome, that the system renews itself at the expense of the individual who challenges it. The question the theorists ask about these recurring structures is, are they conscious? Did the writers of Family Guy deliberately build a grammatical system into the show, a set of narrative rules that they follow consistently enough to communicate something? Or did the structures emerge organically, the natural crystallization of a writing culture that developed certain habits over many seasons? The answer is probably both, and the answer probably does not matter as much as the fact of the structures themselves. Whether conscious or organic, they are real. They shape the experience of watching the show in ways that are distinct from what any individual episode can produce. They are the show's long-game communication, the message that emerges from the full length of the run rather than from any single episode. The most poignant recurring structure in Family Guy, and the one that carries the most of the show's emotional weight, is the one that involves Peter and Lois, and a moment of genuine connection followed by a return to the ordinary tensions of their marriage. It happens many times across the show's run. Some external pressure, an adventure, a conflict, a threat to their family, brings Peter and Lois into close emotional proximity. They see each other briefly with the full attention that ordinary life does not allow. They remember why they chose each other. And then the pressure resolves and they go back to being the slightly irritable, slightly disconnected version of themselves that most episodes of the show present. The structure says the connection is real, the love is real. But the ordinary life does not easily accommodate the full expression of it. The moments of genuine seeing are there, and they are beautiful, and they do not last. This is, when you step back from it, a remarkably honest thing for a comedy to say about marriage. And Family Guy says it not once but dozens of times across decades of television, in the margins of episodes that are mostly about something else entirely. The private language of Quahog, in the end, is a language about the difference between what we have and what we need, between the life we live and the life we glimpse in moments of unexpected clarity. It is a language that the characters cannot speak directly, but that the show, over its long run, has learned to write with considerable fluency. You just have to know how to read it. Section 14. Death, Return, and the Rules of Mortality in Quahog. Family Guy has a complicated relationship with death. Characters die and come back. Characters are killed and then appear in later episodes as if nothing happened. The rules of mortality in Quahog are genuinely difficult to parse, and the fan community has been trying to parse them since at least the middle of the show's run. What we can say with confidence is this: death in Family Guy is real when the narrative needs it to be real, and it is revocable when the narrative needs it to be revocable. This sounds tautological, but it is actually a meaningful statement, because the show's choices about which deaths to honor and which to undo are consistent enough to suggest a logic, a hidden set of principles about what mortality means in the world of the show. Brian Griffin's death in Season 12 is the obvious place to start, because it is the most significant, the most discussed, and the most theoretically fertile death in the show's history. Brian was hit by a car in the episode Life of Brian, and he died. The show treated this death with a gravity and an emotional commitment that it rarely brings to any event. The family grieved, A replacement dog, Vinny, was introduced, and 2 episodes later, Stewie used a time machine to prevent the death, restoring Brian to the timeline. The fan response to this sequence was one of the most intense in the show's history. Some fans were devastated by the death and relieved by the reversal. Others were furious at what they perceived as a cheap manipulation, a death engineered to generate media attention and boost ratings, followed by a reversal engineered to relieve the emotional pressure. Seth MacFarlane commented publicly that the death was always intended as temporary, a statement that further divided the fan community along lines that remain active to this day. The theoretical question the Brian death raises is not about whether it was narratively satisfying. Reasonable people disagree about that and will continue to disagree. The question is, what does it mean within the world of Quahog that Brian died and came back? The purgatory theory offers one answer. Nothing truly dies in a purgatory. Death in purgatory is a transition between states rather than a final end. Brian died in the sense that he was removed from one configuration of the story, and he came back in the sense that the story reconfigured itself to include him again. The fact that the mechanism for his return was Stewie's time machine does not change the fundamental structure. The world of Quahog needed Brian, and Brian came back. There is a version of the death theory that is more specific and more disturbing, and it involves the question of which Brian came back. When Stewie uses the time machine to prevent Brian's death, he goes back to the moment before the accident and warns Brian to move out of the path of the car. The Brian who survives is not the Brian who died. He is a Brian from a slightly different configuration of the timeline, one in which the accident never happened. The Brian who was struck by the car, who died on the operating table, who was mourned by the Griffins. That Brian is still dead. He died in his timeline. He just does not exist in the revised timeline that Stewie's intervention created. This means that every Brian since Season 12 is technically a different Brian from the one who preceded him. Not different in any way that the characters could perceive or that the show acknowledges, but different in the sense that the continuity of identity across death and revival is, at minimum, philosophically complicated. The fan community has noted that post-revival Brian does behave slightly differently. Not dramatically, not in ways that the show calls attention to, but in the specific texture of his personality and his relationships. Some fans have attributed this to the natural variation in characterization across writing seasons. Others take the view that the difference is deliberate, that the show is encoding, in Brian's subtle post-revival characteristics, the signal that something changed when Stewie's time machine altered the timeline. If this is true, then there is a Stewie somewhere, a Stewie who lost Brian and did not find a way to get him back, who is alone in the original timeline. A Stewie whose best friend died and stayed dead. And that Stewie, in the dark somewhere outside the show's narrative, is perhaps the version of the character whose grief was real and whose loss was final. The deaths that were not revoked tell their own story about the show's mortality rules. Several characters have died across Family Guy's run and have not been brought back, or have returned only as ghosts, as memories, as figures in flashbacks rather than as active participants in the present timeline. Diane Simmons, the news anchor who becomes a murderer in a Season 8 episode and is shot by Stewie at the episode's end, is dead and has remained dead. She was a recurring character with significant screen time, and her death was treated as permanent. The difference between Brian's death and Diane Simmons' death tells you something about the mortality rules of Quahog. Brian is family. He is inside the circle of the show's emotional core, woven into its most important relationships, carrying too much of its narrative weight to be permanently absent. Diane Simmons is adjacent. Significant, but not structurally necessary. The show could continue without her, and it did. The theory that has emerged from this pattern is sometimes called the essentiality theory. It holds that mortality in Quahog is governed by a single principle. Characters die permanently when they are not essential to the continuing story, and are revived when they are. The show's hidden logic sorts characters into essential and non-essential, and the sorting determines who stays dead and who comes back. This is a cold logic, and it might sound reductive, as if the show is mechanically calculating narrative necessity rather than making emotional or dramatic choices. But the essentiality theory does not claim that the calculations are explicit or conscious. It claims that they reflect the deeper needs of the story, which are in turn a reflection of something fundamental about what the story is trying to do. The story knows what it needs. The mortality rules enforce those needs. Characters who are essential to what the story is doing cannot be allowed to be permanently absent. The most interesting extension of the essentiality theory involves Meg. Meg has never been killed. She has been endangered, threatened, humiliated, and dismissed, but she has never died. And according to the essentiality theory, this is because Meg is essential, perhaps the most essential character in the show. She is the one who holds the system together, who absorbs the family's dysfunction, who carries the weight that allows the other characters to continue cycling through their patterns. If Meg died, the theory holds the show would collapse. Not in a narrative sense. The other characters would continue. But something fundamental about what the show is doing, the hidden logic of the scapegoat and the system that requires her, would dissolve. And without that logic, without the load-bearing structure of Meg's suffering, the other characters would have to become something else. They would have to find a different way to manage the dysfunction that Meg currently absorbs. They might, in other words, have to grow. And the show has not yet decided whether it wants that. The mortality rules of Quahog are, in the end, the most transparent expression of the show's priorities. What it keeps alive tells you what it values. What it allows to die tells you what it can afford to lose. And the pattern, viewed across the full run of the series, tells a story about a world that values continuity over consequence, that values the familiar circle over any individual within it, and that is willing to bend the rules of death and time in order to keep that circle intact. That is both the show's greatest weakness and its most human quality, because it is, in the end, the same calculation that most of us make about the people and places we love. We find ways to keep them present. We bend the rules of distance and time and possibility. We refuse, when we can, to let the things that matter most to us stay dead. Quahog just happens to have a time machine. Section 15. The Chris Griffin Paradox. The character the show forgot to use. There is a character in Family Guy who has been present since the first episode, who has a voice and a face and a consistent set of traits, who appears in nearly every episode across the show's entire run, and who has nonetheless managed to remain almost entirely unexplored by both the show itself and the fan community that has spent decades pulling the show apart. That character is Chris Griffin. Chris is 17, or approximately 17. The show, as we have established, does not age its characters, so Chris has been approximately 17 for 25 years. He is the oldest Griffin child, the son who precedes Meg in the birth order, if we set aside the real father question, and he is drawn and voiced as a heavy, earnest, somewhat dim boy with a gentle disposition, and a talent for art that the show introduces and then mostly ignores. The interesting thing about Chris, the thing that the fan theories about him tend to center on, is that he is the character who most closely resembles the Peter of the early seasons. He is not stupid in the mean, self-serving way that later season Peter is stupid. He is sweet and confused and trying his best in a world that seems faintly beyond his comprehension. He is likable in the way that early Peter was likable. You are never frustrated by Chris the way you are frustrated by what Peter becomes. You are at most quietly fond of him, and you wonder why the show does not give him more to do. The Chris theories begin from a simple observation. Chris is the most consistently kind person in the Griffin family. Not the most interesting, not the most complex, not the most funny, but the most reliably kind. He does not participate in the cruelty toward Meg with the same enthusiasm that the rest of the family does. He has moments of genuine sweetness toward strangers that the other Griffins would never produce. He is in a show about a family that has become increasingly defined by its dysfunction, the family member who seems least touched by that dysfunction. The theory that has developed around this observation is one that takes the kindness not as a character trait, but as a signal. Chris in this reading is the character who most fully escaped the Flanderization that destroyed Peter and Brian. He remained, across 25 years of broadcast, essentially the same person he was in the first season. Not because the writers were particularly thoughtful about his development, but because they mostly left him alone. And leaving him alone preserved something that the characters who received more attention lost. He is what Peter would have been if the show had kept its hands off him. The art talent is worth dwelling on because it is one of the most consistently referenced and most consistently underutilized details in Chris's characterization. Chris can draw, not just competently. He has been shown in several episodes to have a genuine facility for visual art that goes beyond what you would expect from a character defined primarily by his amiable dimness. He has produced works that are recognized as impressive. He has shown an instinct for representation and expression that marks him as someone who, in a different story, might have art as the central fact of his life. The show has a recurring joke where Chris is told his art is being sabotaged or observed by a greased-up deaf guy, a recurring background character. But this has never been developed into anything with actual narrative consequence. The art sits there, season after season, as a detail about Chris that everyone registers and nobody follows up on. The fan theory that takes the art most seriously suggests that it is the key to understanding Chris's position in the show's mythology. Art is, among other things, a way of seeing, a way of looking at the world with sufficient attention that you can reproduce it. An artist is someone who pays attention to what is actually there rather than what is supposed to be there. And in a world as constructed and as artificial as Quahog, an artist with genuine facility might be, without knowing it, someone who can see through the construction. Chris has never had an episode where this ability is developed or explored. But the theorists who watch him carefully note that Chris, across the run of the show, has occasional moments of apparent perception that seem to go slightly beyond what his characterized intelligence would suggest. Small moments where he notices something, where he registers something, where he seems briefly to be aware of a dimension of his world that the other characters do not perceive. These moments are always played as comedy, as accidental profundity from the dim kid. But their consistency suggests something more deliberate. In the convergence theory, which holds that Quahog is a collapsed composite of multiple timelines, Chris is sometimes theorized as the character most sensitive to the residue of the other timelines. His art is a form of channel. He is drawing things from timelines he has never consciously inhabited, producing images that carry echoes of versions of his world that do not exist in the current configuration. His apparent dimness is not lack of intelligence, but lack of conscious processing. He takes in more information than he can articulate, and the art is where some of it comes out. This is admittedly a theory that the show provides only the most minimal direct support for. Chris is an underwritten character, and the theories about him reflect the frustration of fans who can see what he could be rather than what he is. But that frustration is itself interesting. The Chris theories are the show's absent potential made visible, the ghost of a character arc that was never written. In a show as densely theorized as Family Guy, the most untheorized character is sometimes the most revealing one. Chris Griffin, standing quietly at the edge of the frame, his sketchbook in hand, drawing whatever he sees, tells you by what the show has chosen not to do with him, something important about the limits of what the show could imagine for itself. Section 16. Lois Griffin, the most complicated woman in Quahog. The fan theories about Lois Griffin tend to split into two broad categories, and the split itself is revealing. The first category takes Lois at face value as a long-suffering wife and mother, who is genuinely trying to maintain something coherent in a household that works against coherence at every turn. She is the reasonable one, the grounded one, the person who loves Peter despite everything, who advocates for the children when Peter is failing them, who manages the ordinary logistics of family life while her husband is doing whatever reckless and spectacular thing he has decided to do this week. In this reading, Lois is the show's moral center, or the closest thing to one that the show offers. The second category is considerably darker, and it has gained significant ground in the fan community over the years. It observes that Lois is not, in fact, consistently the person the first category describes. She is, across the show's run, one of the most inconsistently characterized people in the cast. She has been shown to be capable of extraordinary cruelty, of complete detachment from her children's welfare, of moral hypocrisy that matches or exceeds anything her husband demonstrates. She has had moments of warmth and moments of coldness that do not feel like the natural range of a single person's emotional life. She feels, in the second category's reading, like two different characters whose separate elements have been combined without full integration. The theory that accounts for this most completely is the one that takes Lois's backstory seriously. Lois Pewterschmidt grew up in a wealthy family with complicated emotional dynamics. Her father, Carter Pewterschmidt, is a domineering, emotionally cold patriarch who openly favors financial success over human connection. Her mother, Barbara, is a figure whose own emotional suppression is so complete that she has little visible interior life. Lois chose Peter, a working-class man her family disapproved of, as a form of rebellion against this world. She chose simplicity, warmth, ordinary life. But the theory holds that Lois never fully escaped the values her family instilled in her. Beneath the warm mother exterior is a woman who was raised by people who valued social performance over authentic emotion, who were capable of enormous cruelty in the name of propriety, who treated love as a transactional rather than a freely given thing. And this woman keeps surfacing. The cold Lois, the contemptuous Lois, the Lois who treats Meg with a dismissiveness that mirrors Carter Pewterschmidt's treatment of anyone he considers beneath him. This is not a different character breaking through unexpectedly. It is the original character, the Lois who exists beneath the rebellion, the Lois who is her father's daughter no matter how far she has tried to run. The theorists who hold this view find evidence throughout the show. Lois's treatment of Meg, which escalates from mild inattentiveness in the early seasons to something closer to contempt in the later ones, parallels her father's manner too precisely to be coincidental. Her occasional bursts of aggressive self-assertion, her willingness to pursue her own desires at the expense of her family, her capacity for manipulation when she wants something, these are the traits of the Pewterschmidt world, not the warmth and simplicity world she ostensibly chose when she chose Peter. The most interesting version of the Lois theory connects her characterization to the purgatory framework in a specific and poignant way. If each character in Quahog is working through something they cannot resolve, Lois's unresolvable tension is the one between who she chose to be and who she was made to be. She chose Peter. She chose Spooner Street. She chose the simpler life. But every time the choice seems secure, the other version of herself surfaces. The Pewterschmidt, who evaluates people by their utility and dismisses those who do not measure up. She cannot escape her upbringing, and her upbringing cannot escape her. The two versions of Lois cycle through the seasons of the show, each one dominating for a while before giving way to the other, never resolving into a synthesis, never arriving at a self that is fully integrated and at peace. This is actually a recognizably human condition. Most people who have grown up in difficult or complicated family environments spend significant portions of their adult lives negotiating the gap between who they want to be and who their formative experiences made them. The show presents this negotiation in Lois's characterization without ever explicitly naming it. And the result is a character who feels, when you look at her carefully, more real than any of the show's obvious comedy suggests. There is a specific theory about Lois and the Meg situation that deserves extended treatment. The theory is that Lois knows. Not that Meg is not Peter's biological daughter. There is strong evidence that Lois knows this, since she was the one who had the relationship with Stan Thompson. But that Lois knows what Meg's role in the family system is. That Lois understands on some level that Meg functions as the family's scapegoat, and that Lois has made a quiet, never articulated decision to allow this to continue. This would make Lois's treatment of Meg not the thoughtless cruelty of a woman who has absorbed her mother's coldness without realizing it, but something more calculated and more disturbing. The deliberate management of a family system by a woman who has decided that Meg's sacrifice is the price of everyone else's stability. Who has looked at the choice, protect Meg at the cost of the family's equilibrium or allow the system to continue, and has chosen the system. The theory does not require Lois to be a villain. It requires her to be a person who has made a terrible compromise and who lives with that compromise without ever being able to examine it directly. This is, again, a recognizably human condition. The compromises that hold families together are often terrible, and the people who make them often cannot afford to look at them too closely because looking too closely would require dismantling everything. Lois Griffin in this reading is the architect of Quahog's status quo. Not the most visible architect, Peter's energy and charisma make him the apparent center of the family system. But the real center, the person whose choices determine what the family is and what it is allowed to be, is Lois. And her choices, made quietly and mostly invisibly across 25 years of the show, are the hidden infrastructure of everything we have been discussing tonight. She chose this. She keeps choosing it. And the fact that she sometimes shows something that looks like regret, the warm moments, the genuine connections, the episodes where she advocates for Meg or sees Peter clearly, suggest that she knows the cost of what she has chosen. She just cannot choose differently. That is, in the end, one of the show's most honest observations about the nature of family. That the structures that hold families together are maintained by choices that nobody can fully acknowledge making. That the people at the center of those structures are trapped by their own centrality. That the warmth is real and the cruelty is real, and both of them are expressions of the same fundamental condition. The condition of someone who loves their family and has organized the entire world around keeping that family intact at whatever cost the world requires. Section 17. The God and Devil Problem. Supernatural logic in Quahog Family Guy has a god. He appears in the show as a physical character, depicted as a large, bearded, somewhat weary male figure who inhabits an indistinct heavenly space, and who interacts with the world of Quahog with a frequency and directness that most theological traditions would find surprising. God in Family Guy has gone on dates. He has been responsible for disasters. He has appeared in episodes and been held accountable for things by the show's human characters. He is, within the world of the show, real. Not symbolically real or metaphorically real, but actually real. A being who exists and who can be reached, more or less, if you know how. The devil also exists in this world. He has appeared, he has made deals with characters. He has operated with the predictable mythology of the devil as dealmaker, the supernatural entity who offers you what you want in exchange for something you will regret giving. The existence of confirmed, physically present divine and infernal entities in the world of Family Guy has significant implications for every theory we have discussed tonight, and those implications are generally underexplored in the fan community. Let us take them seriously for a few minutes. If God is real and present in Quahog, then the purgatory theory has immediate support. Purgatory is, in its traditional theological formulation, a state maintained by divine intention. God has arranged for souls to be in that state, and God can release them from it when the conditions are met. A God who makes dates and watches television and occasionally shows up to apologize for floods is not a God who is managing purgatory with careful theological precision. But he is a God who is present, who is aware of the world of Quahog, who has the capacity to intervene. The purgatory theory, updated to account for God's confirmed presence in Quahog, becomes: the Griffins are in purgatory. God knows they are there. And God has decided, for reasons that are not entirely clear but that reflect the divine logic of a being who is simultaneously omniscient and somewhat bumbling, to let the situation continue. The cycling, the stasis, the inability to fully resolve the tensions that keep the characters in their loops. These are not the result of some impersonal mechanical force, but of a specific, personal decision by a being who has the power to end the cycle and has chosen not to. This reframes the comedy of the show in a striking way. When Peter does something reckless and gets away with it, God is watching and has decided to let him. When Meg suffers and the family ignores her, God is watching and has decided to allow that too. When Brian drinks too much and fails to finish his novel and cycles through another series of doomed relationships, God is present for it and has at some point made a decision about when and whether to intervene. The question of why God would maintain this particular purgatory, why the griffins in particular, and why in this particular configuration, is one that the theory cannot fully answer, and this is perhaps the most honest admission the theory can make. Divine logic, as depicted in Family Guy, is not fully legible to human reasoning. God in Quahog is a character who combines omniscience with apparent indifference, vast power with selective intervention. He does things and does not do things by criteria that are his own. The devil's presence complicates the picture further. If the griffins are in a purgatory maintained by God, the devil's involvement suggests that the stakes of the situation are higher than a simple waiting room for souls. Deals with the devil in the Family Guy universe have real consequences. Characters have traded things of genuine value for things that seemed worth the trade and turned out not to be. The devil is not a figure of comedy only. He is a figure with actual contractual power in a world where contracts of this kind can be enforced. Several theories have built on the devil's presence to argue that the specific configuration of the Griffin family, the specific balance of dysfunction that the show maintains, is not the natural result of their personalities, but the result of a deal made by someone at some point. That someone traded the possibility of the family's genuine happiness for the maintenance of a specific kind of stability. That the cycling, the inability to change, the reset button that gets pressed after every moment of potential growth. These are the terms of a contract that is still in effect. Who made the deal is the theory's central mystery. The candidate pool is actually quite small if you think about it. It would need to be someone who had both the desire and the opportunity to make such a contract. It would need to be someone with enough awareness of the family's dynamics to understand what terms would effectively lock those dynamics in place. The most compelling candidate the fan community has proposed is not Peter or Lois or any of the adult characters. It is Stewie. A Stewie from early in the timeline, like a Stewie who was still primarily the evil genius, still capable of the kind of cold, calculated action that building world domination devices requires, might have made a deal with the devil at some point before the show's narrative begins. Or in an early episode that established a contract whose terms continue to operate invisibly in the background. What would early Stewie want enough to trade for it? Stability. Control. The assurance that his world, the family, the house, the neighborhood, the specific configuration of relationships that defines his existence, would remain in place. The evil genius's desire for world domination is, at its core, a desire for control. And a deal that guaranteed the permanent stability of his immediate environment at the cost of everyone's ability to genuinely change or grow would be exactly the kind of deal that a Stewie operating in his early season mode might have found attractive. If this deal exists, it would explain almost everything. The reset button. The inability of characters to retain the lessons of emotional episodes. The way Meg's suffering is maintained systemically. The cycling of Peter's impulsiveness and remorse. All of it would be the operation of a contract that Stewie made, possibly without fully understanding the consequences, possibly while in the middle of one of his more grandiose schemes, and that has been running ever since. And if Stewie is aware of the contract now, if the softer, more emotionally complex Stewie of the later seasons has discovered or remembered what his earlier self did, then his inability to undo it would be one of the darkest elements of his characterization. The evil genius who locked his family in stasis in exchange for control, and who cannot take it back. The gun in Brian's safety deposit box, which he reveals in one of the show's most emotionally devastating scenes, takes on an additional weight in this reading. Brian knows something is wrong with the world. Brian has always known, and the knowledge that the wrong thing is permanent, that it was contracted, that it cannot be changed, is the specific despair that makes a being as intelligent as Brian reach for that particular solution. He does not use the gun. Stewie talks him out of it in the episode with genuine love and genuine fear. But the gun is there. It has always been there. And the theory suggests that it is not the random, dark impulse of a depressed dog person, but the logical conclusion of an awareness that has nowhere else to go. The awareness that the world is broken, that the breaking was a choice, and that the choice cannot be undone. These are heavy thoughts for the late night or the early morning or wherever you happen to be right now. But Family Guy, for all its comedy, has always been willing to carry heavy thoughts. It just carries them beneath the jokes, in the places where you have to look carefully to find them. And the finding, when it happens, changes the texture of everything else. Section 18. The Chicken Fights. Every battle is the same battle. If you have watched Family Guy with any regularity, you know about the chicken fights. Peter Griffin and a giant chicken, Ernie, who is named but whose name is rarely used, have been engaged in an escalating, increasingly catastrophic series of physical confrontations across the show's entire run. The fights begin in a relatively straightforward context. Peter is given a coupon by the chicken, the coupon turns out to be expired, and Peter attacks the chicken in retaliation. The chicken fights back. The fight spirals outward into an increasingly elaborate and destructive confrontation that always ends with one or both of them apparently defeated. And then, episodes or seasons later, the fight resumes. The chicken fights are among the most analyzed sequences in Family Guy fan discussion, and the analyses range from the straightforward to the philosophically elaborate. At the straightforward end, the fights are a running gag about disproportionate responses to minor provocations. Peter's reaction to an expired coupon is insane, and the show is making a joke about the way small slights can escalate into enormous conflicts when the people involved are sufficiently committed to their grievance. This is funny. It is also, as a statement about human behavior, accurate enough to sting slightly. At the more elaborate end, the chicken fights are a metaphor for something that the show has never quite named, but that the fight's internal logic keeps pointing toward. The fights always end without resolution. Peter defeats Ernie, or Ernie defeats Peter, and the survivor continues about their life. But the fight itself, the grievance that sparked it, the coupon, the slight, is never actually addressed. No one apologizes. No one acknowledges that the conflict escalated to a degree far beyond what the original provocation warranted. The slate is not cleared, and this is why the fights keep resuming. Because the underlying issue was never resolved, only the immediate confrontation was ended. This is the theory at its simplest. The chicken fights are the show's extended metaphor for the perpetuation of conflict through the refusal to resolve its origin. Every fight is a resumption of the same fight. Every confrontation inherits the energy of all the confrontations before it. The fighters have been fighting for so long that the original coupon, if they could even remember it, would be almost comically insufficient as an explanation for the accumulated weight of their violence. The theorists who take this further connect it to the purgatory framework in a way that is illuminating. In purgatory, you keep being confronted with the thing you have not resolved. If the chicken represents, in some symbolic sense, the thing Peter cannot resolve, the minor slight, the unaddressed grievance, the moment when someone treated him as less than he felt he deserved, then the perpetual resumption of the fight is the purgatorial loop in its most physical, most visible form. Peter keeps fighting the same fight because he keeps failing to address the same underlying condition. What is that underlying condition? The most compelling answer is the feeling of not being taken seriously. The expired coupon is an injury to Peter's sense of his own status. He was given something that turned out to be worthless. He was treated as someone whose time could be wasted, whose expectations could be disappointed without consequence. The chicken is the figure that represents every moment when the world has suggested to Peter that he is not as important as he believes himself to be. And Peter cannot resolve this. He can win a fight, but he cannot address the feeling that generated the fight, because the feeling is too fundamental to be addressed through a fistfight. Even a fistfight that destroys several city blocks and a moving train. The chicken keeps coming back because the feeling that the chicken represents keeps coming back. And it keeps coming back because it is, in some sense, correct. Peter is not as important as he believes himself to be, and some part of him knows it. And the only way he has ever found to manage that knowledge is to fight the thing that most clearly embodies it. There is one more dimension of the chicken fight theory that has generated significant discussion, and it involves the chicken himself. Ernie is not simply a prop. He has a family. There are episodes where Peter encounters Ernie's domestic life. His wife, his children, the ordinary suburban existence that surrounds the episodes of extreme violence. Ernie, it turns out, is a fully realized person in his own right. He has people who love him. He has a life that the chicken fights disrupt as profoundly as they disrupt Peter's. The theory that has developed from this observation holds that the chicken fights are actually tragic, that both participants in these confrontations are beings who would prefer a different life, but who have become locked into a cycle that neither of them can step out of. Ernie presumably does not want to spend decades in escalating physical combat with a middle-aged man from Rhode Island. Peter presumably does not want to keep risking his life over an expired coupon. But the cycle has its own momentum now, and neither of them can find the door out of it. This is, once again, the purgatorial structure. Two beings locked in a pattern that perpetuates itself, unable to resolve the thing that would release them, unable to stop returning to the same confrontation. But it adds something that the other purgatorial examples in the show do not quite achieve: genuine sympathy for both participants. Peter and Ernie are not adversaries in the traditional sense. They are co-victims of a situation that long ago stopped being about the original provocation and became about something neither of them can name. The final chicken fight, if the show ever produces one, if it ever stages a confrontation that ends with genuine resolution rather than another inconclusive suspension, would need to be something different from all the ones before it. It would need to be the one where Peter and Ernie look at each other and, however briefly, recognize what they have been doing and what it has cost both of them. The fight that resolves is the fight that admits the coupon was never the point. Whether Family Guy in any of its remaining seasons will give us that moment is uncertain. The renewal through season 27 is now confirmed. 4 more seasons, each with 15 episodes taking the show through 2028 and 2029 toward the 30th anniversary. That is a great deal of runway. And somewhere in that runway, the chicken is still out there, waiting. The same grievance unresolved, the same fight unresumed, until it is. Section 19. The Multiverse Question. Which timeline are we in? The existence of Stewie's time machine means that the world of Family Guy is not one world. It is many worlds, collapsed at some points and branching at others. A multiverse of quahogs produced by every time travel event that Stewie has initiated over the show's run. Stewie has traveled backward in time to prevent events. He has traveled forward to observe futures. He has visited parallel dimensions and alternative configurations of his world. He has died in some of those configurations and survived in others. He has met versions of himself from other timelines and has interacted with those versions in ways that affected the timeline he returned to. The cosmological implications of this are not modest. The fan community has spent considerable effort attempting to map the different timelines the show has visited and to understand the relationship between them. This is a task that the show itself does not make easy, because the show's treatment of time travel is inconsistent in ways that may be deliberate, or may simply reflect the difficulty of maintaining continuity across a writing staff that changes over many seasons. What the theorists have arrived at, after much debate, is a loose framework that most serious fans find useful, even if they disagree about the specific details. The framework holds that there is a prime timeline, the configuration of the show that the current episodes inhabit, and that the prime timeline is not the original configuration of the world. The original configuration, sometimes called Timeline Zero by theorists, is the world as it was before Stewie built the time machine and began altering the past. Timeline Zero is inaccessible now because so many alterations have been made that it can no longer be reached directly. What exists as the prime timeline is a product of accumulated alterations, a world that has been shaped, sometimes profoundly and sometimes in tiny ways, by dozens of trips through time. This means that the characters who exist in the current episodes are not quite the characters who existed at the show's beginning. They are versions of those characters who have been shaped by a history that has been altered. Peter is not the Peter of Timeline Zero. Lois is not the Lois of Timeline Zero. Meg is not the original Meg. Every character is a version of themselves that has been produced by all the changes that have been made to the world over the course of Stewie's temporal adventures. The implication for characterization is significant, and explains some of the show's most persistent inconsistencies. Characters who seem to act differently from episode to episode, who demonstrate values in one scene that they abandon in another, who appear to have memories in some contexts and lack those memories in others. These inconsistencies in the multiverse framework are the residue of multiple timelines bleeding into each other. The current Peter sometimes behaves like the Peter who came from a slightly different branch of history. The current Brian occasionally demonstrates knowledge or makes choices that are more consistent with an alternative configuration of his life than with the primary configuration. The show in this reading is literally haunted by the ghost versions of its characters from all the timelines that converge to produce the current one. When a character seems out of character, they are not being written badly. They are being momentarily possessed by the version of themselves from a world that no longer fully exists. There is an episode that stands as the clearest evidence for the multiverse framework, and it is one that the fan community has analyzed more thoroughly than almost any other. The episode Back to the Pilot from Season 10 features Brian and Stewie traveling back in time to the very first episode of the show and observing the original pilot from an outside perspective. They watch the original Griffin family, compare what they see to what they know, and observe the ways the world has changed since the beginning. They also, in a remarkable moment, observe a version of themselves, the original Stewie and Brian of the pilot era, and are visibly uncomfortable with the encounter. The discomfort is played for comedy, but the theorists take it seriously. If Brian and Stewie were simply the same people traveling back in time, encountering their past selves would be strange but not particularly disturbing. The discomfort the episode depicts is the discomfort of people encountering someone who is almost them but not quite. Someone who came from the same origin but whose history diverged at some point in ways that are not fully legible from the outside. In the multiverse framework, the Stewie and Brian of the pilot era are the Stewie and Brian of a different timeline from the one that the current episode's versions of those characters inhabit. They look the same. They have the same names, but they are, in a meaningful technical sense, different people. And the current Stewie and Brian's discomfort is the instinctive recognition of that difference. The way you might feel meeting someone who shares your face but whose life has gone in an entirely different direction. The question the multiverse framework leaves most tantalizingly open is, what is the current timeline moving toward? If the prime timeline is a convergence, if it is the product of all the alterations that have been made, then it is in some sense the most developed and most complex version of the world. The one with the most information incorporated into it. And if time travel continues to operate within this world, the timeline will continue to evolve. Every new Stewie adventure adds information, adds complexity, shifts the balance. The theory holds that the timeline is moving toward resolution, that the accumulated complexity of all the alterations is building toward a moment when the world becomes coherent enough to move forward. When the convergence is complete enough that the stasis lifts and the Griffins can age and time can resume its directional movement. This would be the end of Family Guy. Not necessarily the last episode, but the moment when the show's hidden narrative arc arrives at its conclusion. The moment when the world it has been building, slowly and circuitously and with enormous amounts of comedy along the way, finally has enough coherence to let go of the past and move into the future. Whether Seth MacFarlane or the show's writing staff would ever allow this moment to happen is a question that the April 2025 renewal through Season 27 makes more uncertain than ever. The show continues because it continues, and the ending, if it comes, will need to be something the writers choose rather than something the narrative demands. But in the timeline, somewhere, the moment is building. The convergence is ongoing. The information is accumulating, and the Griffin family, cycling through their patterns in their frozen neighborhood, is slowly becoming the version of itself that will eventually be ready to move. Section 20. What it all means. Sitting with the show's final question. We have been traveling for a long time tonight, through purgatory and delusion, through timelines and Easter eggs, through the private language of a neighborhood that does not age and the private griefs of characters who cannot resolve their central tensions. And I want to end not with another theory, but with a question. A question that all of the theories we have explored are, in their different ways, trying to answer. Why does Family Guy, after 25 years of broadcast and a trajectory that by conventional standards should have led to cancellation long ago, still have an audience? Why do people still watch it? Not the people who have always watched it and watch it out of habit, but the people who come to it fresh and find themselves returning. Why do the theories keep generating? Why do fans still pause the video and zoom into the newspaper headlines and map the geography of Quahog and debate the mortality rules and write long analyses of Meg's scapegoat function? The cynical answer is the one the show itself sometimes offers: inertia. It is cheap to produce and profitable to maintain, and it will keep going until the economics stop working. This is true, but it is not sufficient as an explanation for the emotional investment that the show's audience continues to demonstrate. Even the audience that professes to love the show while criticizing almost everything about its later seasons. The real answer, I think, is something the theories have been circling all night. Family Guy is a show about people who are stuck, who cannot change, who love each other imperfectly and keep hurting each other, and keep returning to the same house and the same table and the same conversations. And the reason people keep watching is that this is recognizable. Not in the cartoon way, not the recklessness and the cutaways and the absurdity, but in the underlying structure. The inability to fully become who you want to be. The way love and cruelty can coexist in the same relationship without either canceling the other out. The way time passes and nothing is quite resolved and the people you love are still the people you love, despite all the ways they have failed you. Quahog is frozen, but the feeling it produces is not frozen. The feeling it produces is the very specific ache of a world that keeps going, that keeps presenting itself as permanent and secure, while everything within it is perpetually in the process of becoming something else and never quite getting there. The theories are the audience's attempt to understand why they feel something when they watch this show, to find the architecture beneath the comedy, to explain why a cutaway gag can make you laugh and 2 scenes later something can make your chest feel strange in a way that is not quite sadness and not quite nostalgia, but is something in the region of both. The architecture is there. We have been walking through it tonight. And now, at the end of the walk, it makes a different kind of sense than it did when we started. Spooner Street is a place where people are stuck, and they have made the best home they can out of being stuck. That is the show. That is what it has been doing, across all the cutaways and the chicken fights and the Meg jokes and the Brian novels and Stewie's unfinished schemes. It has been building a home out of stasis, a world where the inability to move forward has been converted through an enormous amount of effort and creativity and genuine love into something worth spending time in. That is, when you hold it up to the light, not such a bad thing to have built. The Griffin family will be at dinner tomorrow. They will be at dinner next week and next season, and in 2028 and in 2029. They will be at dinner forever in the specific forever of a television show that has decided it wants to keep going. And at that dinner table, beneath all the jokes and all the cutaways and all the things they cannot say to each other, they will be doing what they have always been doing. Being a family. Imperfectly. Cyclically. Endlessly. And Peter will say something stupid, and Lois will roll her eyes with love, and Stewie will have a thought that nobody hears, and Brian will pour another drink, and Meg will sit quietly at the edge of things, carrying what she carries, and the clock on the wall will say whatever time it needs to say. And outside, Quahog will be exactly what it always was. A note before you drift. If you have made it this far, through all 20 sections, all the theories and the Easter eggs and the quiet corners of Quahog that nobody usually looks at, then you are exactly the kind of person this video was made for. The kind who watches carefully. The kind who looks twice. The kind who suspects rightly that the most interesting things are usually the ones in the background, half visible, waiting for someone patient enough to notice them. Drop a comment. Tell me which theory changed the way you see the show. Tell me where you are and what time it is. Hit subscribe if you have not already, and sleep well wherever you are. The Griffin family will be there when you wake up.